We begin with the land itself, because Cleopatra's story cannot be understood without first looking closely at the setting that shaped her. Ancient Egypt, by the time of her birth, was already one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. The Nile River had been the backbone of life there for thousands of years. Every year, its waters rose and flooded the banks, spreading rich black silt across the land. This natural rhythm gave Egypt its agricultural strength. Wheat, barley, vegetables, and papyrus grew in abundance. The river was both lifeline and highway, carrying boats filled with grain, goods, and people from the southern reaches to the northern delta. The Nile's cycles gave a sense of predictability to Egyptian life, something the desert on either side could never provide. Beyond the green riverbanks stretched the sand, endless and barren, which made Egypt at once isolated and protected from many outside threats. By Cleopatra's time, however, this ancient stability was under strain. Egypt was no longer the independent, mighty kingdom it once had been. It was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family of Greek origin that had come to power after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander's general, Ptolemy, had claimed Egypt as his share of the empire after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. From then on, the Ptolemies reigned as pharaohs, presenting themselves as successors to the age-old traditions of Egyptian kingship, while privately keeping their Greek language, customs, and identity. This created a dual world. On the one hand, the Ptolemies were kings of Egypt, appearing in temples carved with hieroglyphs, wearing the crowns of the pharaohs, and honoring the gods. On the other hand, they lived in the Greek world of Alexandria, a cosmopolitan city on the Mediterranean coast, where philosophers, mathematicians, and traders mixed in a bustling port that connected Egypt to the wider Hellenistic world. Cleopatra was born into this world of overlapping cultures around 69 BCE. Her family was Greek-speaking, tracing its roots back to Macedonia. Yet she grew up in a land where the common people still prayed to Isis, Ra, and Osiris, and where centuries of tradition demanded that a ruler be more than a monarch. A pharaoh was expected to be the mediator between gods and men, the guarantor of prosperity, and the protector of the land. This tension between her Greek heritage and her Egyptian throne would shape much of Cleopatra's rule, because she would become one of the few Ptolemaic monarchs to fully embrace both sides of her realm. The wider world around Egypt was turbulent. Rome was rising in power, pushing its influence across the Mediterranean. By the time Cleopatra was a child, Rome had conquered Greece and much of Asia Minor. Its legions were feared, its politicians ambitious, and its appetite for expansion unending. Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain supply, made it an attractive prize. The Ptolemaic rulers were aware of this and often sought alliances with Rome, though such friendships came at the cost of independence. Cleopatra's reign would unfold in this shadow, where Egypt's survival depended on diplomacy, cunning, and sometimes on personal charm. The city of Alexandria, where Cleopatra spent her early years, was the jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean, founded by Alexander himself. It was designed to be a city of order and culture. Its streets were laid out in straight lines, with grand avenues and impressive buildings. At its heart was the famous Library of Alexandria, said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, making it a center of learning unmatched in the ancient world. Nearby stood the great lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships safely into the harbor. The city was filled with Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and merchants from as far as India, all contributing to a diverse and dynamic environment. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by this richness, where languages and ideas flowed freely. Life for the common people in Egypt, however, was not as grand. Farmers toiled along the Nile, their lives tied to the river's floods. They paid heavy taxes to support the lavish spending of the Ptolemies. The dynasty was known for internal strife, with family members often plotting against one another. Brothers and sisters married to keep power within the family, and palace intrigues frequently ended in poisonings, murders, or sudden disappearances. Cleopatra was born into a dynasty that survived by constant maneuvering, and this atmosphere of danger and betrayal must have influenced her from an early age. The religious world of Egypt also framed Cleopatra's story. The goddess Isis was especially significant. She was seen as a mother, a protector, and a figure of power and wisdom. Later, Cleopatra would deliberately associate herself with Isis, presenting herself as the goddess incarnate on earth. This was a clever way to bridge the gap between her Greek family and her Egyptian subjects, showing herself not merely as a foreign ruler, but as a true pharaoh who embodied Egypt's deepest traditions. Thus, when we picture the world of Cleopatra's birth, we must see layers. There was the timeless Nile, flowing as it had for millennia. There was the Greek ruling family, living in luxury within Alexandria's palaces. There was the Egyptian population, rooted in ancient customs and faith. And there was Rome, a distant but looming presence, already eyeing Egypt's resources. All of this created the stage upon which Cleopatra would act, a stage where power, culture, and survival intertwined. This first look at her setting gives us the framework. In the next segment, we will turn to Cleopatra's early life, her education, and how she prepared to step into this demanding role as both a Greek princess and an Egyptian queen. As we continue, we now move closer into Cleopatra's personal beginnings. We have already looked at the wider world she was born into, with Egypt divided between Greek rulers and Egyptian traditions, and Rome pressing closer from abroad. Now we step into the palace walls of Alexandria, where Cleopatra grew from a child into a young woman destined for power. Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE, the daughter of Ptolemy XII, known to history as Ptolemy Auletes, or the flute player. He earned this nickname because he was more interested in music and pleasures than in serious rule. His reign was unstable, marked by debt and dependence on Rome. Still, as his daughter Cleopatra was raised inside the royal court, surrounded by tutors, attendants, and the trappings of Greek-Egyptian royalty, the palace itself, although its remains are now lost beneath the modern waters of Alexandria's harbor, was likely a sprawling complex decorated with marble columns, lush gardens, and painted halls. This was the environment where Cleopatra spent her earliest years. What set Cleopatra apart from many of her predecessors was her education. The Ptolemies, being Greek in origin, valued learning. Alexandria itself was a city of scholars, home to mathematicians, philosophers, and astronomers. Within the palace, Cleopatra received an elite education, one that went far beyond what most women of her time could expect. She studied languages, philosophy, science, and politics. Ancient sources tell us she could speak several tongues, including Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and even some African dialects. This skill was unusual for her dynasty, because most Ptolemaic rulers never bothered to learn Egyptian, the language of the majority of their subjects. Cleopatra's decision to master it gave her a unique connection to her people. In addition to languages, she would have studied rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively. This was an essential tool in an age where politics often depended on oratory and personal charm. She likely read works of Homer and the great Greek tragedians, absorbing the cultural heritage of her Macedonian ancestors. Mathematics and astronomy were also part of her studies, reflecting the intellectual climate of Alexandria. It is no surprise that later writers praised her wit and intellect as much as her beauty. She was not a passive princess waiting for fortune, but a young woman preparing herself with every advantage knowledge could offer. Her family life, however, was far from peaceful. The Ptolemaic dynasty was infamous for internal rivalries. Brothers and sisters often married to keep the royal bloodline intact, but they also turned on one another in violent struggles for the throne. Poisonings, assassinations, and sudden deaths were common. Cleopatra grew up knowing that survival in her family required sharp instincts and the ability to read hidden motives. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was insecure on his throne. He relied heavily on Roman support to maintain his power, even paying bribes to influential Roman leaders. This dependence created resentment among Egyptians, who saw their ruler as weak and foreign. For Cleopatra, watching her father's precarious rule must have been an early lesson in the dangers of relying too much on outside powers. The palace environment also exposed her to Egypt's religious and ceremonial traditions. From a young age, Cleopatra would have witnessed elaborate processions honoring the gods, where pharaohs appeared as divine figures. These rituals were not mere pageantry. They reinforced the idea that a ruler was more than a politician. To the Egyptian people, the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of divine order. Later in life, Cleopatra would embrace this fully, aligning herself with the goddess Isis and presenting herself as a living deity. But even as a child, she would have understood the power of symbolism and the importance of appearing not just as a monarch, but as a sacred figure. Daily life for a royal child like Cleopatra was a mixture of privilege and pressure. She had servants and tutors at her disposal. She wore fine clothing woven from Egyptian linen, adorned with gold jewelry crafted by skilled artisans. She ate meals that included bread, honey, figs, dates, and fish from the Nile, all far richer than the diet of ordinary Egyptians. Yet, despite the luxury, she was never free from the awareness that her future would be bound to the throne. Every lesson she learned, every ritual she observed, prepared her to take part in the dynastic struggles that awaited her. Outside the palace, the Egyptian world was changing. The people bore heavy taxes to fund the extravagance of the Ptolemaic court and its payments to Rome. Unrest simmered in the countryside, and the wealth gap between rulers and commoners was wide. Cleopatra's later popularity among Egyptians suggests that even as a young girl, she may have been unusually aware of her subjects' lives. Her choice to learn their language, to present herself as one of them, points to a deeper understanding of her role as queen than many of her predecessors possessed. By her teenage years, Cleopatra was already marked as intelligent, politically aware, and confident. Ancient writers, even those hostile to her, acknowledged her presence. They described her as a woman whose voice, wit, and charm could sway powerful men. Such skills did not appear overnight. They were the result of years of training and sharp observation within the palace. She grew up watching her father negotiate, beg, and maneuver with Rome, and she saw firsthand the dangers of both dependence and defiance. In these early years, Cleopatra also learned about the city that would remain her base of power, Alexandria. She walked through its streets, filled with traders from distant lands. She may have looked up at the lighthouse of Pharaohs, towering hundreds of feet into the sky, a symbol of Egypt's connection to the wider world. She surely knew of the great library, with its shelves of knowledge from every corner of the known world. This atmosphere of learning and international exchange shaped her mind. As Cleopatra approached adulthood, the pressures of dynastic politics grew sharper. Her father's throne was shaky, and her siblings, including her sisters Berenice and Arsinoe, were rivals in waiting. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, even family bonds could not be trusted. For Cleopatra, becoming queen would mean not only ruling Egypt, but also surviving the constant threats from within her own household. With this understanding of her early years, we can see the foundation of Cleopatra's later power. She was not merely born into a throne. She was shaped from childhood to navigate danger with intelligence, charm, and resilience. In the next segment, we will follow her father's troubled reign and exile, a period that would deeply affect Cleopatra and force her to confront the realities of Rome's growing influence over Egypt. We now turn from Cleopatra's childhood to the troubled reign of her father, Ptolemy XII, Auleus. Understanding his struggles is essential because his choices shaped the world Cleopatra inherited. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, Egypt was a rich but fragile kingdom. Its fertile Nile Valley and its grain exports made it invaluable to the wider Mediterranean world. But its rulers were deeply insecure. Ptolemy XII embodied this instability more than most. Ptolemy XII was not a strong ruler. He was known for his love of music, earning him the nickname Auletes, or the flute player. Ancient writers portrayed him as weak, indulgent, and more concerned with his pleasures than with ruling effectively. But his greatest weakness was his dependence on Rome. By the time of his reign, Rome was the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. It had conquered Greece, parts of Asia Minor, and was pressing into the eastern kingdoms. Egypt, though still independent, was vulnerable. Its wealth tempted Roman generals, and its grain was vital to feed the growing population of Rome itself. Ptolemy XII knew he could not resist Rome militarily. Instead, he tried to secure his throne by buying Roman protection. He borrowed vast sums of money and paid heavy bribes to Roman leaders. In particular, he sought the support of Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, two of the most influential men in Roman politics at the time. These payments kept him on his throne, but they drained Egypt's treasury and increased resentment among his people. Egyptians saw their king as a puppet of Rome, enriching foreigners while burdening his subjects with crushing taxes. This tension exploded in 58 BCE, when Ptolemy XII was forced into exile. A revolt broke out in Alexandria, driven by anger over his payments to Rome and his weakness as a ruler. The people declared his daughter, Berenice IV, as queen in his place. For 3 years, Ptolemy wandered in Rome, seeking support to reclaim his throne. Cleopatra, still a young girl at the time, witnessed this turmoil firsthand. She remained in Egypt during much of her father's exile, but the lesson was clear. Egypt's throne depended not only on the will of its people, but also on the approval of Rome. In Rome, Ptolemy XII spent lavishly to gain allies. He bribed powerful senators, including Pompey, to lobby for his restoration. His efforts eventually succeeded, and in 55 BCE, with the help of Roman military force, he returned to Egypt. The Roman general, Aulus Gabinius, led the campaign, defeating Berenice IV and reinstating Ptolemy. Cleopatra's sister was executed, a grim reminder of how dangerous dynastic rivalries could be. For Cleopatra, still only about 14 years old, this was a formative experience. She saw her sister rise to power, only to be killed when Rome intervened. She also saw how her father regained his throne, not through strength of his own, but through the armies of Rome. Ptolemy XII's restoration came at a steep cost. He was now even more dependent on Rome. He owed enormous debts to Roman financiers and politicians. To pay them, he increased taxes on Egypt, further alienating his subjects. The Roman soldiers who remained in Alexandria to secure his rule were a visible reminder of Egypt's compromised independence. Cleopatra grew up in a court overshadowed by these foreign troops and by the constant awareness that Egypt's fate was tied to Rome's decisions. Despite these troubles, Ptolemy XII tried to secure the succession for his children before his death. He wanted to ensure that Rome would support his chosen heirs. He left a will naming Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as joint rulers. This was consistent with Ptolemaic tradition, where brothers and sisters often co-ruled and sometimes married to preserve the dynasty. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was about 18 years old. She suddenly found herself queen, thrust into power alongside her brother. But before we look at Cleopatra's early years as queen, it is important to consider what she learned from her father's reign. She learned that Rome's involvement in Egypt was inevitable, and that survival meant mastering diplomacy with Roman leaders. She also learned that Egypt's people resented rulers who seemed too submissive to foreign powers. Balancing these two pressures, appeasing Rome while maintaining Egyptian loyalty, would define her own reign. She also witnessed the brutal reality of Ptolemaic politics. Her sister Berenice's execution was not just a family tragedy, but a warning. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, power was never secure. Brothers and sisters could quickly become rivals, and Roman intervention could tip the balance. Cleopatra would face these same challenges in the years to come, particularly in her struggle with her brother Ptolemy XIII. During this period, Cleopatra's character began to stand out. Ancient accounts suggest she was already gaining a reputation for intelligence and determination, while her father had relied almost entirely on bribery and Roman backing. Cleopatra would later use her wit, charm, and diplomatic skill to influence Rome's most powerful men directly. This was the key difference between them. Where Ptolemy XII appeared weak and dependent, Cleopatra would present herself as an equal player on the stage of Mediterranean politics. The shadow of Rome, however, could never be ignored. By the late 50s BCE, Rome itself was entering a period of internal conflict. The First Triumvirate, an alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, was breaking apart. Civil wars were on the horizon. Cleopatra inherited her throne in a world where Egypt's independence depended not only on Rome, but also on which Roman faction prevailed. Aligning with the wrong side could be disastrous, yet standing apart was nearly impossible. So as Cleopatra took the throne in 51 BCE, she did so with the memory of her father's exile, the knowledge of her sister's death, and the awareness of Rome's looming presence. She was young, intelligent, and ambitious, but her position was already precarious. Egypt's future and her own survival would depend on how she navigated these overlapping dangers. In the next segment, we will move into Cleopatra's first years as queen, her uneasy co-rule with her brother Portorist, and the conflicts that quickly arose as she sought to establish herself as Egypt's true ruler. We now arrive at the moment when Cleopatra herself first steps into power. With her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, gone, the throne of Egypt passed to his chosen successors, Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. She was about 18 years old while he was still a child. According to the terms of their father's will, they were to rule jointly, as was customary in the Ptolemaic dynasty. This often meant that siblings, even very young ones, were married to one another to preserve royal bloodlines. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were no exception. Yet beneath this surface arrangement, tensions quickly emerged. Cleopatra, though young, had already shown signs of independence and ambition. Unlike many of her ancestors, she made a conscious effort to present herself not only as a Greek monarch, but as a true Egyptian pharaoh. She adopted Egyptian dress and customs, appeared in temples alongside priests, and crucially, spoke to her subjects in their own language. This distinguished her from earlier Ptolemies, who had often remained aloof from the majority of the population. By embracing Egypt's traditions, Cleopatra positioned herself as more legitimate in the eyes of her people. At the same time, she was facing the reality of palace politics. Ptolemy XIII's guardians, particularly his advisors and regents, did not intend to let Cleopatra dominate. Chief among them was a powerful court official named Pothinus, who became a central figure in the young king's circle. Pothinus and others around Ptolemy XIII saw Cleopatra as a rival to their influence. Because her brother was still a minor, they sought to rule in his name, sidelining Cleopatra wherever possible. Thus, from the very beginning, Cleopatra's reign was contested. Egypt itself was not in a stable condition. The kingdom was under financial strain, from her father's debts to Rome. There were shortages, and the heavy taxes imposed to pay Rome's demands had created resentment. On top of that, the Nile failed to flood properly in Cleopatra's first years as queen, leading to famine. Food scarcity always placed rulers in a vulnerable position because Egyptians expected their pharaoh to maintain prosperity. Cleopatra, who had inherited both her father's debts and his dependence on Rome, now had to prove that she could secure Egypt's survival. The political backdrop beyond Egypt was equally unstable. In Rome, the first triumvirate had collapsed. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, were moving toward open conflict. Crassus, the third member of their alliance, had died in battle in 53 BCE. This left Caesar and Pompey as the two dominant figures in Roman politics, their rivalry threatening to erupt into civil war. For Cleopatra, this was both a danger and an opportunity. Whoever emerged victorious in Rome would hold enormous sway over Egypt's fate. Cleopatra initially attempted to assert her authority directly. She placed her image alone on some official documents rather than jointly with her brothers, suggesting she saw herself as the senior ruler. Ancient sources also describe her personally, addressing delegations and foreign envoys, something unusual for a female monarch of the time. This independence may have won her respect among some Egyptians, but it also fueled the resentment of her brother's advisors. Tensions grew steadily until they reached open conflict. By 49 BCE, Cleopatra was forced into exile. Her brother's faction, led by Pothinus, had gained the upper hand in Alexandria. Cleopatra fled to Syria, where she began raising her own forces to reclaim her throne. This was a bold move, reflecting her determination and resourcefulness. She was not content to accept her downfall. Instead, she gathered troops and prepared for war against her own brother. For a young queen barely in her 20s, this was a remarkable show of resilience. At this very moment, events in Rome dramatically altered the course of Cleopatra's life. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, declaring war on Pompey. The Roman world was plunged into civil war. Pompey fled to the east, seeking allies, while Caesar pursued him. Their conflict would eventually carry them to the shores of Egypt, pulling Cleopatra and her brother directly into the center of Rome's power struggle. The coincidence of Cleopatra's exile and Caesar's pursuit of Pompey was decisive. Cleopatra, seeking to return to Egypt, now had to navigate not only the hostility of her brother's court, but also the presence of Roman armies. When Pompey fled to Egypt in 48 BCE, after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus, he expected to find refuge. Instead, he was betrayed by Ptolemy XIII's advisors, who ordered his assassination to curry favor with Caesar. This act of treachery shocked the ancient world and set the stage for Cleopatra's legendary meeting with Caesar. For now, we must pause and recognize what these early years reveal about Cleopatra's character. She was ambitious, willing to assert her independence against powerful opposition. She embraced Egyptian identity more fully than any Ptolemy before her, giving her an edge in legitimacy. And when driven from power, she did not surrender but gathered forces to fight her way back. These traits, intelligence, resilience, and daring, would define her reign. Her relationship with Rome was about to change everything. With Pompey dead and Caesar arriving in Egypt, Cleopatra saw her opportunity. She understood that aligning with Caesar could restore her throne just as Rome had once restored her father. Yet unlike her father, who had bowed to Rome's demands with bribes, Cleopatra would attempt something bolder. She would use her personal presence, her wit, and her charm to win Caesar's direct support. Thus, as we close this part of her story, Cleopatra is in exile, her throne claimed by her younger brother's advisors, her kingdom divided, and her fate uncertain. But the Roman civil war was about to bring Julius Caesar himself into Egypt, creating the conditions for Cleopatra's most famous entrance. In the next segment, we will explore Cleopatra's dramatic return to Alexandria and her legendary first meeting with Caesar, a moment that would not only change her fortunes, but also alter the course of Egypt and Rome alike. When we last left Cleopatra, she had been driven into exile by the faction loyal to her brother Ptolemy XIII. She was still very young, but she had already shown a determination to fight for her throne. Rather than fade into obscurity, she gathered troops in Syria and prepared to return to Egypt. This decision reveals much about her character. She was not content to be a passive player in palace intrigues. She understood that rule in Egypt required both strength and the ability to seize opportunity. The next opportunity came from an unexpected source: Rome's civil war. By 48 BCE, Julius Caesar had defeated Pompey the Great at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey, desperate and defeated, fled to Egypt, where he hoped to find refuge. After all, he had once supported Cleopatra's father and was still seen as a powerful Roman whose favor could secure Egypt's position. But the advisors around Ptolemy XIII, led by Pothinus, had other ideas. They feared Caesar would soon arrive and wanted to demonstrate loyalty to him in advance. They arranged for Pompey's assassination as soon as he landed. His murder, carried out on Egyptian soil, was meant as a gift to Caesar. Instead, it horrified him. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly after, he was presented with Pompey's severed head. Ancient accounts say he turned away in disgust. Pompey had once been his son-in-law, married to Caesar's daughter Julia. Even though they had become rivals, Caesar was appalled by the dishonorable killing. This reaction immediately put Ptolemy XIII's advisors in a difficult position. They had hoped to win Caesar's gratitude, but instead they provoked his suspicion. It was into this volatile moment that Cleopatra re-entered the scene. Still in exile, she understood that Caesar's presence in Egypt could tip the balance in her favor. Unlike her brother's faction, who had blundered by killing Pompey, Cleopatra sought to win Caesar's trust. She realized that aligning herself directly with him was her best path back to power. But to do this, she needed to bypass the guards and advisors surrounding her brother in Alexandria. The story of how she accomplished this became one of the most famous episodes in her life. According to later writers, Cleopatra arranged to be smuggled into Caesar's presence. Some accounts claim she was rolled inside a rug or a bed sack, carried past the guards, and presented to Caesar in his quarters. When the bundle was unrolled, Cleopatra emerged before the Roman general. Whether or not the details are entirely accurate, the symbolism of the story mattered. Cleopatra's daring entrance revealed her boldness and theatrical sense. She understood that first impressions could define relationships, and she chose to present herself as both resourceful and unforgettable. Caesar was reportedly captivated, not only by Cleopatra's appearance, but by her intelligence and charm. Ancient sources often emphasize her beauty, but many also note that her power lay more in her presence and wit than in physical looks alone. She spoke eloquently, carried herself with confidence, and had the ability to make her company feel compelling. In Caesar, she found someone who respected intellect and ambition, and she made an immediate impression. Cleopatra's appeal to Caesar was also political. She presented herself as the rightful ruler of Egypt, wronged by her brother's advisors. Caesar, eager to establish stability in the region, saw value in supporting her claim. Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain, was vital to Rome, and Caesar understood that backing Cleopatra could give him a loyal ally on the throne. Thus, their personal connection quickly aligned with strategic interests. This sudden alliance infuriated Ptolemy XIII's faction. The young king, still surrounded by his advisors, was enraged that Cleopatra had won Caesar's favor. Tensions escalated rapidly, and open conflict broke out in Alexandria. This became known as the Alexandrian War, a struggle in which Caesar and Cleopatra's forces faced those of Ptolemy XIII. The fighting was fierce, with street battles and sieges throughout the city. At one point, a fire broke out in Alexandria, damaging parts of the famous library. Though the extent of the destruction is debated, the memory of that blaze became legendary. Through it all, Cleopatra stayed close to Caesar, working alongside him to secure her position. She understood that her future depended on his support, and she did not let the opportunity slip away. The combination of her resourcefulness, her ability to adapt, and her willingness to take risks made her a powerful ally for Caesar. Eventually, the war turned in their favor. Ptolemy XIII's forces were defeated, and the young king himself drowned in the Nile while attempting to flee. With him gone, Cleopatra's position was secure once again. She was restored to the throne, this time with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as her nominal co-ruler. But in truth, she was the dominant force. Caesar's backing ensured that her authority was recognized, and her enemies within the palace were silenced. This period marked a turning point in Cleopatra's life. She had been exiled and nearly lost everything, but through bold action and a shrewd alliance with Caesar, she regained her throne. More than that, she gained a partner who would change the course of her reign and her place in history. Their relationship, both personal and political, would soon produce a son, Caesarion, and would draw Cleopatra even more deeply into the struggles of Rome. For Caesar, the affair with Cleopatra was more than a romance. It was a political alliance that secured Egypt as a friendly kingdom during his rise to absolute power in Rome. For Cleopatra, it was the means to survive, to rule, and to position herself at the center of Mediterranean politics. This blending of personal attraction and strategic necessity was characteristic of Cleopatra's entire life. She did not separate her private choices from her political needs. In her world, survival demanded both. By the time Caesar departed Egypt, Cleopatra had emerged stronger than before. She was no longer a young queen, overshadowed by her brother's advisors. She was the recognized ruler of Egypt, allied with the most powerful man in Rome. Her throne was secure, her authority re-established, and her reputation growing. Yet this alliance also tied her fate more closely than ever to the fortunes of Rome. In the next segment, we will explore Cleopatra's rule during the years immediately following Caesar's support, her consolidation of power, and her role as both queen and mother, as she gave birth to Caesarion, the son she hoped would secure her dynasty's future. We now move forward into the years immediately after Cleopatra's dramatic return to power with Caesar's help. The Alexandrian War had ended with the death of her brother Ptolemy XIII, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne as Queen of Egypt. This victory was decisive, but it was only the beginning of her efforts to secure stability in her kingdom. For Cleopatra, survival meant not only holding on to power, but also ensuring the future of her dynasty. After Ptolemy XIII's defeat, Cleopatra was officially paired with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as her co-ruler. This arrangement followed Ptolemaic tradition, but in practice, Cleopatra was the dominant monarch. Ptolemy XIV was still a child, and his presence served more as a symbolic continuation of dynastic custom than as a true sharing of authority. Cleopatra, with Caesar's backing, controlled Egypt. This was a remarkable achievement for a woman of her age, especially in a dynasty notorious for internal rivalries. Caesar remained in Egypt for several months after the war, consolidating Roman influence and strengthening his bond with Cleopatra. During this time, their relationship deepened into both a political and personal partnership. Ancient writers often focus on the romance between them, but for Cleopatra, the affair was more than personal. By aligning herself with Caesar, she secured not only her throne, but also Egypt's independence in an age when Rome could easily have reduced it to a province. For Caesar, Cleopatra offered loyalty, resources, and a strategic ally in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their time together in Alexandria was remembered for its splendor. Later accounts describe elaborate banquets, river journeys on gilded barges, and nights of conversation where Cleopatra displayed her wit and learning. These stories may contain exaggerations, but they reflect the impression Cleopatra made. She was not only a queen, but also a captivating presence who could engage even the most powerful Roman of the age. Caesar, who had conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey, found in her a ruler who matched his ambition in her own sphere. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV, Philopator Caesar, more commonly known as Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. The name itself was bold. It declared her child as the son of Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. Whether Caesar formally acknowledged Caesarion as his son is debated, but Cleopatra's intent was clear. She saw her child as both heir to Egypt and as a bridge to Rome, potentially uniting the two greatest powers of the Mediterranean through blood. The birth of Caesarion strengthened Cleopatra's position. In Egyptian tradition, motherhood was closely tied to legitimacy and divine symbolism. Cleopatra associated herself with the goddess Isis, and Caesarion could be seen as the divine child Horus. This reinforced her role as a living goddess queen, strengthening her bond with the Egyptian people. At the same time, presenting Caesarion as Caesar's son elevated her standing in Roman politics, even if it also created tension among Caesar's rivals in Rome. With her throne secure and her dynasty renewed, Cleopatra turned her attention to ruling Egypt. She worked to restore stability after years of turmoil. The country had suffered from heavy taxation, famine caused by low Nile floods, and the disruption of war. Cleopatra's policies aimed to restore prosperity. She re-established trade, oversaw agricultural production, and took measures to ensure the Nile Valley recovered, though the details of her administration are not as well recorded as the dramatic events of her life. Ancient records show her active role in economic and political decisions. She issued decrees in her own name, appeared in temples across Egypt, and reinforced her image as both a Greek monarch and an Egyptian pharaoh. One of her strengths was her ability to navigate cultural duality. In Alexandria, she embraced her Greek heritage, ruling as a Ptolemaic queen in the city built by Alexander the Great. Yet in the countryside, she presented herself as a traditional pharaoh, speaking Egyptian and performing the rituals expected of a ruler. Few of her predecessors had managed this balance, and it gave her unusual popularity among her subjects. Meanwhile, Caesar eventually returned to Rome, leaving Cleopatra in control of Egypt. Before he departed, however, she accompanied him on a journey along the Nile. Ancient writers describe a grand voyage where Cleopatra and Caesar sailed upriver, possibly to showcase Egypt's wealth and to reinforce Cleopatra's authority in the eyes of her people. Whether this voyage extended as far as Nubia or was more limited, the symbolism mattered. It displayed the unity of the Roman conqueror and the Egyptian queen, presenting Cleopatra not as a client ruler, but as a partner. When Caesar departed for Rome, Cleopatra faced the challenge of ruling in his absence. Yet her position was stronger than ever. She had a son who tied her dynasty to Caesar's legacy. She had eliminated her most dangerous rival, Ptolemy XIII, and kept her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, in a subordinate role. She had restored stability to a kingdom that had nearly collapsed under her father's debts and mismanagement. For the first time in years, Egypt had a ruler who seemed both capable and legitimate. Still, challenges remained. Rome continued to dominate the Mediterranean, and Caesar's political enemies would never forget his connection to Cleopatra. In Egypt itself, rivalries lingered, and the presence of a child co-ruler always carried the possibility of palace intrigue. Cleopatra's survival depended on maintaining her alliance with Caesar and on ensuring that Caesarion would be recognized as his heir. Her decision to visit Rome in the following years showed both courage and ambition. She did not wait passively in Egypt for her fate to be decided by Roman politics. Instead, she sailed to Rome with Caesarion and Ptolemy XIV, entering the very heart of Caesar's world. This bold move revealed her confidence and her determination to secure recognition for herself and her son. Thus, the years after her restoration were a time of consolidation and preparation. Cleopatra had transformed from an exiled queen into one of the most powerful women of the ancient world. By giving birth to Caesarion, she linked her dynasty to Rome's most powerful leader. By restoring order in Egypt, she showed her ability to govern as well as to intrigue. She was no longer simply fighting for survival. She was laying the foundation for her vision of a strong, independent Egypt, tied to Rome not as a subject, but as a partner. In the next segment, we will follow Cleopatra's journey to Rome, her time in the capital alongside Caesar, and the impact she made on Roman society, where she was both admired and resented as a foreign queen who dared to stand beside Caesar. With her throne secured and her son Caesarion born, Cleopatra made a bold decision that few foreign rulers dared attempt. She traveled to Rome, entering the very center of power in the Mediterranean world. This journey was not just symbolic, it was strategic. By appearing in Rome at Caesar's side, she sought to secure her own legitimacy as Queen of Egypt and to strengthen her son's claim as the child of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra's arrival in Rome likely occurred in 46 BCE. During the period when Caesar was at the height of his power, he had returned victorious from his campaigns, celebrated multiple triumphs, and was preparing for his eventual dictatorship. The presence of the Egyptian queen in the capital was both a statement and a challenge. For Caesar, it demonstrated his dominance. He was not merely a Roman leader, but a man whose influence reached into the courts of foreign monarchs. For Cleopatra, it was a calculated risk. Rome was filled with rivals who resented Caesar, and by aligning herself so publicly with him, she placed herself directly in their gaze. She did not stay in the city unnoticed. Ancient sources tell us that Cleopatra resided in one of Caesar's estates outside the city, likely across the Tiber River. This location allowed her to remain close to Caesar, while avoiding direct residence within the sacred boundaries of Rome, where foreign monarchs were not officially welcome. Still, her presence was unmistakable. She attended events, appeared with Caesar, and made an impression on Roman society. To the Romans, Cleopatra was a figure of fascination and controversy. On the one hand, she represented Egypt, a land of immense wealth and ancient prestige. She was learned, elegant, and carried herself with the confidence of a monarch who saw herself as Caesar's equal. On the other hand, she was a foreign queen, and her influence over Caesar troubled many Romans. Gossip spread quickly. Some accused her of seducing Caesar and undermining Roman values. Others whispered about Caesarion, questioning whether Caesar had truly fathered him. For conservative Romans, the idea of their leader recognizing a foreign child as his heir was alarming. Caesar himself gave Cleopatra public honors that fueled these suspicions. He ordered a golden statue of her to be placed in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, a shrine he had dedicated to his family's divine ancestor. The message was clear. Caesar linked Cleopatra to Rome's gods and to his own lineage. This was a shocking gesture to many Romans. For Cleopatra, it was a triumph. She was not only a guest in Rome, but a figure officially honored in its temples. During her time in Rome, Cleopatra observed the complexities of Roman politics. She witnessed Caesar's growing power, his reforms, and the tensions building around him. Senators debated his authority. Rivals plotted in secret, and the city buzzed with rumors. Cleopatra, who had grown up in a court filled with intrigue, must have recognized the signs of danger. But she also saw the opportunities. If Caesar could secure his position, Caesarion might one day be acknowledged as his heir. Egypt, through her, could become bound to Rome, not as a province, but as part of Caesar's dynasty. Her stay in Rome also deepened her reputation as a cosmopolitan ruler. She moved comfortably in a foreign capital, speaking with Roman leaders, displaying her knowledge, and holding her own in conversations where few women were present. This ability to operate in both Egyptian and Roman spheres made her unique. She was neither fully outsider nor insider, but a bridge between worlds. Yet the longer she stayed, the more resentment grew among Caesar's enemies. For them, Cleopatra symbolized the dangers of Caesar's unchecked ambition. They feared he intended to make himself king, perhaps even to rule jointly with her, bringing foreign monarchy into the heart of the Republic. These suspicions, whether true or not, added to the anger that eventually led to Caesar's assassination in 44 BC. When the Ides of March arrived and Caesar was struck down by conspirators, Cleopatra's world shifted once again. She had lost her greatest ally in Rome, the man who had restored her throne and given her a place in Mediterranean politics. Suddenly, she was a foreign queen in a hostile city, vulnerable to the shifting winds of Roman power. Her priority was clear: protect herself and her son. Soon after Caesar's death, she quietly left Rome and returned to Egypt, where she would face new challenges in securing her throne without Caesar's direct protection. Despite the risks and controversies, Cleopatra's visit to Rome had lasting effects. She had asserted herself as more than just a regional monarch. She had made her presence felt in the capital of the world's most powerful state. She had introduced herself and her son to Rome's elite, and she had demonstrated her ability to operate at the highest level of politics. For Romans, whether they admired or despised her, she was unforgettable. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra resumed her rule with Caesarion as her heir, but without Caesar to shield her, she needed to navigate a new political landscape. Rome descended into chaos after Caesar's death, as his allies and assassins clashed for control. For Cleopatra, the question was which Roman leaders to support and how to maintain Egypt's independence amid the turmoil. In the next segment, we will follow Cleopatra's return to Egypt after Caesar's assassination, her efforts to secure Caesarion's position, and her first steps in dealing with the new Roman order that emerged from the ashes of the Republic. With Caesar gone, Cleopatra faced a dramatically changed world. She had traveled to Rome as the partner of the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. She left it a widow of sorts, no longer shielded by his authority, and returned to Alexandria, where her throne was suddenly less secure. For Cleopatra, Caesar's death in 44 BCE was both a personal blow and a political crisis. She now had to chart a path forward without him, relying on her own skills to defend her dynasty. When Cleopatra sailed back to Egypt, she brought with her not only memories of Caesar's Rome, but also the living proof of their connection, her son Caesarion. In her eyes, he was the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy, and she wasted no time in presenting him as such. Soon after her return, her co-ruler Ptolemy XIV, still a teenager, died under suspicious circumstances. Ancient sources suggest Cleopatra arranged his death to remove a rival and to elevate her son. By making Caesarion her co-ruler, she became sole authority in Egypt while securing the future of her child as the dynasty's next king. This move was both practical and symbolic. By pairing herself with Caesarion, Cleopatra declared to her people and to Rome that Egypt's throne was tied to Caesar's bloodline. She styled Caesarion as the son of the god, associating him not only with Caesar, but also with Egyptian tradition, where the pharaoh was considered divine. In this way, Cleopatra merged Roman and Egyptian symbols, reinforcing her legitimacy on both fronts. But the loss of Caesar also meant the loss of Rome's strongest protector. The city was plunged into turmoil as factions scrambled to control the Republic. The assassins of Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius claimed they had restored liberty, but Caesar's loyalists refused to give up power. Out of this struggle emerged a new alliance known as the Second Triumvirate, formed by Mark Antony, Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, and Lepidus. Together they vowed to avenge Caesar and punish his killers. For Cleopatra, this division in Rome was both a threat and an opening. In the meantime, she focused on consolidating her rule within Egypt. She restored order after the instability of her early reign, ensuring that agriculture along the Nile recovered and that trade through Alexandria resumed. She also reinforced her religious role, presenting herself as the goddess Isis, mother and protector of Egypt. With Caesarion at her side as the divine child, she embodied the myth of Isis and Horus, a powerful image that resonated with her subjects. Still, Egypt's independence remained precarious. The Romans had long seen the kingdom as too rich and too vital to be left entirely alone. Egypt's grain was essential to feed Rome's growing population, and its wealth tempted ambitious generals. Cleopatra knew that sooner or later she would have to deal directly with Rome's new leaders. The question was, whom to support? Initially, she kept her distance. When Brutus and Cassius took control of much of the eastern Mediterranean, they demanded resources from Egypt. Cleopatra, however, was in poor health around this time, possibly suffering from illness after her return from Rome. She was unable to travel and did not provide direct aid. This angered the assassins, who saw her as uncooperative. Later, when Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, Cleopatra's decision not to aid the assassins proved wise. She had avoided siding with the losing cause With the Republic now firmly in the hands of the triumvirs, Cleopatra needed to re-establish her ties with Rome. Of the three men, Mark Antony soon emerged as the one most directly concerned with the Eastern Mediterranean. It was Antony who summoned Cleopatra to meet him, seeking her cooperation and her wealth for his campaigns. This summons set the stage for one of the most famous encounters in history, the meeting between Cleopatra and Antony at Tarsus in 41. Before turning to that episode, it is important to reflect on Cleopatra's resilience in these years. In the space of just a few years, she lost her father, was driven into exile, regained her throne with Caesar's help, traveled to Rome as a queen, watched Caesar assassinated, and returned to Egypt to rule alone. Through each crisis, she adapted, acted decisively, and kept her throne. Few rulers of her time managed such survival, especially in a dynasty known for internal collapse. Her ability to present herself as both a traditional pharaoh to her people and as a sophisticated monarch to the Romans was her greatest strength. In Egypt, she was Isis reborn, mother of Caesarion, the divine child. In Rome, she was Caesar's partner, a queen who could converse with statesmen as an equal. This dual image allowed her to maintain her rule at home while staying relevant abroad. The next stage of her story would bring her into partnership with Mark Antony, a Roman general of immense power and charisma. Their meeting would not only change Cleopatra's fortunes, but would also alter the balance of power in the Mediterranean, drawing Egypt ever deeper into Rome's civil wars. In the next segment, we will explore Cleopatra's legendary first encounter with Antony at Tarsus, the pageantry she used to captivate him, and the new alliance that would dominate the final decade of her life. We now reach one of the most celebrated episodes of Cleopatra's life, her first meeting with Mark Antony in 41 BCE. This encounter, remembered in ancient writings and retold through centuries of art and literature, was more than a romance. It was a calculated act of politics where Cleopatra used her intelligence, her sense of spectacle, and her understanding of human character to win the favor of one of Rome's most powerful men. After Caesar's assassination, the Roman world had fractured. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus had formed the second triumvirate to avenge Caesar and maintain order. They divided Rome's vast territories among themselves, with Antony taking responsibility for the eastern provinces. For Cleopatra, this meant that Antony was the Roman leader whose decisions would most directly affect Egypt. It was Antony who summoned her to Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey, to account for her earlier dealings during the Civil War and to pledge her loyalty to Rome. Cleopatra could have approached this meeting cautiously, appearing as a submissive client queen before a Roman general. Instead, she chose a different path. She understood Antony's character. He was known for his love of luxury, his admiration for spectacle, and his tendency to be swayed by charm. Cleopatra decided to make her entrance not as a petitioner, but as a goddess. The ancient historian Plutarch describes her arrival in dramatic terms. Cleopatra sailed up the Cydnus River on a magnificent barge with gilded stern and purple sails. The oars, made of silver, kept time with music played by flutes and lyres. She lay beneath a canopy, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, or in Egyptian terms, Isis, while attendants fanned her and children dressed as cupids stood at her side. The air was filled with perfumes, and the people of Tarsus rushed to the riverbank to witness the spectacle. By the time Antony was ready to meet her, she had already captivated the city. This performance was no accident. Cleopatra knew the power of image and ceremony. By appearing as a goddess, she placed herself above the level of an ordinary monarch. She presented herself as Antony's equal, not his subordinate. She also appealed to Antony's love of drama and grandeur. He was a man who admired boldness, and Cleopatra's entrance was designed to impress him in precisely that way. When the two finally met, Cleopatra reinforced her spectacle with her personality. She was charming, witty, and fluent in conversation. Ancient sources note that her appeal was not limited to physical beauty. It was her presence, her voice, and her intelligence that won people over. Antony, who was both a seasoned soldier and a man prone to indulgence, found himself drawn to her immediately. Cleopatra invited Antony to dine with her, and the banquets she hosted became legendary. They were filled with exotic foods, fine wines, music, and entertainment. More than mere feasts, they were displays of Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's ability to create an atmosphere of delight. Antony, already impressed by her entrance, now experienced her hospitality and her skill in personal interaction. Cleopatra had turned what could have been a political interrogation into the beginning of an alliance. The political stakes behind this meeting were high. Egypt was one of the wealthiest kingdoms of the Mediterranean, and Antony needed its resources. He was preparing campaigns against the Parthians, Rome's eastern rivals, and required funds and supplies. Cleopatra, on the other hand, needed Roman support to protect her throne and to secure her son Caesarion's position. Their interests aligned, and their personal attraction sealed the alliance. Soon after their meeting, Cleopatra and Antony began a relationship that combined both politics and romance. Antony followed her back to Alexandria, where they spent the winter of 40 BCE together. Ancient accounts describe a period of lavish entertainment, games, and revelry, remembered as the inimitable Livers Club, where Cleopatra and Antony indulged in feasts and amusements while also deepening their bond. To the outside world, this relationship had immediate consequences. Cleopatra now had the backing of one of Rome's most powerful men. Antony, by aligning with her, gained access to Egypt's resources. Yet the partnership also raised eyebrows. Just as Caesar's affair with Cleopatra had once shocked Rome, Antony's involvement with her stirred controversy. Romans wary of foreign influence saw Cleopatra as a dangerous figure who could sway their leaders away from traditional Roman values. Cleopatra, however, was not concerned with Roman gossip. She had secured what she needed most: protection and recognition. With Antony at her side, her throne was safe, and her son's future was brighter. She had once again demonstrated her ability to turn a precarious situation into an opportunity through boldness and charm. The story of her barge and her theatrical entrance at Tarsus is more than legend. It illustrates Cleopatra's method of survival. She understood that politics was not only about armies and treaties, but also about perception and personal influence. By presenting herself as a goddess, she elevated the encounter beyond ordinary politics and transformed it into a partnership between equals. As their relationship deepened, Cleopatra gave birth to twins in 40 BCE, a son named Alexander Helios and a daughter named Cleopatra Selene. These children further strengthened her ties to Antony, ensuring that their partnership was not temporary but dynastic. Through them, Cleopatra linked her dynasty to Rome's ruling elite once again, just as she had with Caesarion and Caesar. Thus, Cleopatra's meeting with Antony marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She had lost Caesar, but found in Antony another powerful Roman whose ambitions matched her own. Together, they would shape the final act of both her reign and the Ptolemaic dynasty. In the next segment, we will follow Cleopatra and Antony through the early years of their partnership, the birth of their children, and the ways in which they attempted to balance pleasure, politics, and power in a world where Rome's judgment was never far away. with Cleopatra and Mark Antony now bound together by politics and personal attraction. The next phase of her story unfolds in Alexandria. After their legendary meeting at Tarsus in 41 BCE, Antony followed Cleopatra back to her capital, where their relationship blossomed into both romance and alliance. For Cleopatra, this partnership offered the stability she needed after Caesar's death. For Antony, it provided wealth, resources, and a powerful partner in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their time in Alexandria was remembered for its extravagance and revelry. Ancient writers, particularly hostile Roman commentators, described feasts filled with wine, music, and games. One account tells of a group they formed, called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to nights of feasting and amusement. Cleopatra and Antony dined on couches of gold, ate rare delicacies, and drank from cups studded with jewels. These stories, whether exaggerated or not, reflect how their life together symbolized both abundance and defiance. In the Roman imagination, Alexandria became a place of exotic luxury, where Antony surrendered to Cleopatra's charms. Yet behind the banquets lay serious politics. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to support his military campaigns, especially his plans to challenge the Parthians, Rome's formidable rivals to the east. Cleopatra provided financial support, ships, and supplies. In return, Antony confirmed her authority as queen and recognized Caesarion as her co-ruler. This recognition mattered enormously to Cleopatra. By tying Caesarion to Caesar's memory and to Antony's authority, she strengthened her son's standing both in Egypt and abroad. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a son named Alexander Helios, meaning sun, and a daughter named Cleopatra Selene, meaning moon. Their names reflected the cosmic imagery Cleopatra often used to frame her dynasty, associating herself with the divine cycles of the heavens. These children were living symbols of her bond with Antony, ensuring that their partnership was not just political, but dynastic. With Caesarion already linked to Caesar, and the twins tied to Antony, Cleopatra had woven her family directly into the fabric of Rome's ruling elite. Antony, however, could not remain in Alexandria indefinitely. His responsibilities as a triumvir pulled him back to Rome, where tensions with Octavian were rising. Before leaving, he attempted to balance his obligations in Rome with his relationship in Egypt. In Rome, he was married to Octavia, Octavian's sister, in an effort to secure peace between the two men. This marriage was a political necessity, but it created a complex situation. Antony now had ties to both Cleopatra and Octavia, reflecting his divided loyalties between East and West, between passion and politics. Cleopatra, for her part, understood that Antony's absence would be dangerous. Without him in Alexandria, she had to maintain her authority alone. Yet she also knew that Antony's marriage to Octavia did not end their bond. When he returned to the East in later years, their partnership resumed with even greater intensity. Cleopatra's ability to maintain his loyalty, despite his Roman obligations, demonstrated both her influence and her insight into Antony's character. During these early years of their partnership, Cleopatra also continued to strengthen Egypt internally. She invested in her kingdom's economy, ensuring that agriculture along the Nile thrived and that Alexandria remained a vibrant center of trade. She promoted building projects and appeared in temples, reinforcing her role as a traditional pharaoh. Her connection with Isis remained central to her image, with Cleopatra presenting herself as the goddess incarnate and Antony as the divine partner. This religious symbolism not only appealed to Egyptians, but also framed their relationship as something more than human, something destined by the gods. The Roman world, however, watched with suspicion. Antony's opponents, particularly Octavian, used his relationship with Cleopatra to portray him as corrupted by an Eastern queen. In Roman propaganda, Cleopatra became a symbol of decadence, a temptress who drew Antony away from his duties. These stories, though exaggerated, were effective. They painted Cleopatra not as a capable monarch, but as a dangerous foreign influence, an image that would eventually play a role in her downfall. For now, though, Cleopatra thrived. She had secured her throne through Caesar, then through Antony. She had given birth to heirs who tied her dynasty to both men. She had maintained Egypt's independence at a time when Rome consumed nearly every other kingdom, and she had built a partnership with Antony that was as much about shared ambition as it was about affection. Their life together in Alexandria was a blend of politics and pleasure, of statecraft and spectacle. It was in these years that Cleopatra's reputation as a queen of immense charm, wealth, and power solidified. To her people, she was a pharaoh who embodied divine order. To her allies, she was a shrewd diplomat. To her enemies, she was a threat. In each role, she showed the same qualities that had carried her through exile and war: resilience, intelligence, and the ability to seize opportunity. But the peace would not last. Antony's ambitions in the east would soon lead him into campaigns against the Parthians, where he would seek Cleopatra's support once again. Their partnership, already tested by distance and Roman politics, would be pushed into new trials as Antony balanced his Roman duties with his Egyptian alliance. In the next segment, we will follow Antony and Cleopatra through these campaigns, exploring how their partnership evolved under the pressures of war and how their enemies in Rome sharpened their attacks against them both. By the late 40s BCE, the partnership between Cleopatra and Mark Antony had already transformed both their lives. She had secured her throne, borne him children, and reinforced Egypt's independence through their alliance. Antony, in turn, gained access to Egypt's wealth and military support. But the next stage of their relationship would test them in a new way: Antony's campaigns in the east, where he hoped to rival the achievements of Julius Caesar by conquering Parthia. The Parthian Empire, stretching across much of modern Iran and Iraq, was Rome's greatest rival in the east. Its cavalry forces had defeated Roman armies before, most famously at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, where Marcus Crassus was killed and his legions destroyed. For Roman generals, victory against Parthia promised glory on a scale equal to Alexander the Great's conquests. Antony, ambitious and eager to match Caesar's reputation, saw Parthia as his path to lasting fame. But campaigns of this scale required vast resources: supplies, ships, money, and troops. Rome itself was still recovering from years of civil war, and Antony's position was complicated by his uneasy alliance with Octavian in the west. It was Cleopatra who provided what Antony needed most. Egypt, rich from the Nile's harvests and Alexandria's trade, could fund armies and fleets. In supporting Antony's eastern ambitions, Cleopatra ensured his dependence on her and reinforced her own role as a central figure in Mediterranean politics. In 37 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra met again in Antioch, in modern-day Syria, to renew their partnership. Their reunion was not only personal, but also political. Antony confirmed Cleopatra's authority over Egypt and even granted her control of additional territories, including parts of Cyprus, Phoenicia, and areas of modern-day Lebanon and Israel. These gifts expanded her realm beyond Egypt's traditional borders, making her more powerful than any Ptolemaic monarch had been in generations. In return, Cleopatra pledged financial and military support for Antony's campaigns. During this time, their family also grew. Cleopatra gave birth to 2 more children by Antony, a son named Ptolemy Philadelphus, and by this point, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene had reached early childhood. Cleopatra now had 4 children, tied to the 2 greatest Romans of her age, a dynastic network that symbolized her vision of Egypt's future. Antony's Parthian campaign, however, proved disastrous. In 36 BCE, he led a massive army eastward, hoping to win a decisive victory. But the Parthians avoided direct confrontation, using their cavalry to harass his forces. Antony's supply lines faltered, his troops suffered from hunger and cold, and disease spread. The campaign collapsed in failure, forcing Antony to retreat with heavy losses. His enemies in Rome, particularly Octavian, seized on this defeat to portray him as reckless and incompetent. For Cleopatra, Antony's failure was a risk. If his prestige collapsed, her alliance with him could threaten her own standing. Yet she responded with loyalty and support. When Antony returned from his failed campaign, Cleopatra welcomed him back in Alexandria, providing aid for his surviving troops and resources to rebuild his strength. Their bond grew deeper, strengthened by adversity. Cleopatra's willingness to support Antony, even after his failures, showed her commitment not only to him personally, but also to the strategy of keeping Egypt aligned with a powerful Roman ally. Meanwhile, Octavian in Rome continued to use propaganda against them. He portrayed Cleopatra as a manipulative queen who had ensnared Antony in her web of luxury and seduction. Stories spread that Antony was abandoning Roman values, dressing like an Egyptian, and living as Cleopatra's consort rather than as a Roman general. These rumors exaggerated the truth, but they were effective in shaping public opinion. In Rome, Cleopatra became a symbol of everything foreign and dangerous, while Antony was depicted as a man corrupted by her influence. Despite the propaganda, Antony and Cleopatra pressed on with their plans. They envisioned a future where their children would rule over a vast Eastern empire, blending Roman and Egyptian traditions. Cleopatra's position as Isis and Antony's role as Dionysus reinforced this vision, presenting their partnership as divinely sanctioned. In Alexandria, they staged ceremonies that emphasized their divine roles, merging politics, religion, and spectacle. But Antony's failures against Parthia left him vulnerable. He needed another victory to restore his reputation, and his gaze turned toward Armenia. In 34 BCE, Antony led a campaign there and achieved some success, capturing the Armenian king. He celebrated this with a triumph in Alexandria, not in Rome. During the celebrations, known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra presented their children with titles and territories. Caesarion was declared King of Kings and acknowledged as Caesar's true son, while the younger children were granted symbolic rule over parts of the eastern Mediterranean. This event alarmed Octavian. To Romans, it looked as though Antony was establishing a rival dynasty centered in Alexandria, with Cleopatra at its heart. Caesarion's elevation as Caesar's son was especially threatening, since it challenged Octavian's own claim as Caesar's heir. From this moment onward, the rivalry between Octavian and Antony, already tense, became irreconcilable. Cleopatra, by supporting Antony and advancing her children's claims, had placed herself firmly in opposition to Rome's future leader. For Cleopatra, however, these years were the fulfillment of her ambitions. She had restored Egypt's strength, expanded her territory, borne heirs with Antony, and positioned her dynasty at the center of Mediterranean politics. She was no longer simply defending Egypt's survival. She was shaping a vision of empire that blended Egyptian tradition with Roman power. In the next segment, we will explore the Donations of Alexandria, in greater detail, the reaction they provoked in Rome, and how Octavian began preparing the propaganda and military campaigns that would eventually bring Cleopatra and Antony to their final stand. The year 34 BCE marked a dramatic turning point in Cleopatra's story. After years of alliance, love, and shared ambition, she and Mark Antony staged a spectacle in Alexandria that sent shockwaves through Rome. Known as the Donations of Alexandria, this event was both a celebration of Antony's recent military victories and a public declaration of the future they envisioned together. It elevated Cleopatra's children to positions of extraordinary power, and in doing so, directly challenged Octavian's claims in Rome. The setting was Alexandria, the city Cleopatra had made into her stage of power. Antony had recently campaigned in Armenia, where he had captured the Armenian king Artavasdes. Though his Parthian campaign had been a disaster, his Armenian triumph allowed him to restore some of his prestige. Instead of parading his victory in Rome, as Roman generals traditionally did, Antony held a triumph in Alexandria. This was a deliberate choice. It symbolized his shift away from Rome as the center of his power and toward Egypt as the heart of his new vision. The spectacle itself was lavish. Cleopatra and Antony appeared on golden thrones in the great gymnasium of Alexandria, dressed as gods. Cleopatra was Isis incarnate, the mother goddess of Egypt, while Antony took the role of Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and conquest. Together, they embodied divine rulership, blending Egyptian and Greek traditions in a way that reinforced their partnership as sacred and destined. Before the gathered Alexandrian population, Antony and Cleopatra distributed vast territories to their children. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was declared King of Kings, presented as the rightful heir of Caesar himself. This title directly challenged Octavian's position in Rome, since Octavian had claimed his authority through Caesar's adoption of him as heir. By elevating Caesarion, Antony and Cleopatra implied that the blood son of Caesar, not the adopted nephew, was the true successor. The other children of Cleopatra and Antony were also honored. Alexander Helios, the twin son, was given rule over Armenia, Media, and Parthia, lands Antony hoped to conquer. Cleopatra Selene, the twin daughter, was granted rule over Cyrenaica and Libya. The youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was given territories in Syria and Asia Minor. Cleopatra herself was declared Queen of Kings, presiding over her children's titles with divine authority. For the Alexandrians, this display was awe-inspiring. It reinforced Cleopatra's position as a goddess queen and promised a glorious future for Egypt at the center of a new Eastern empire. For Antony, it was a chance to demonstrate his power and to tie his legacy to his children rather than to Rome. For Cleopatra, it was the pinnacle of her ambitions, her children crowned as rulers of multiple lands, her son Caesarion proclaimed the true heir of Caesar, and herself recognized as the living Isis. But in Rome, the reaction was outrage. Octavian seized on the donations of Alexandria as proof that Antony had abandoned his Roman identity. The idea that a Roman general would hold a triumph in a foreign city, elevate a foreign queen, and bestow Roman lands on her children was scandalous. Even more alarming was Caesarion's recognition as Caesar's son, which directly threatened Octavian's position as Caesar's sole heir. If Romans accepted Caesarion's legitimacy, Octavian's claim to power could collapse. Octavian's propaganda machine went to work. He portrayed Antony as a traitor to Rome, bewitched by Cleopatra's charms and enslaved by her luxury. Cleopatra was cast as a dangerous temptress who lured Antony away from his duty. Pamphlets and speeches accused Antony of planning to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria, and of intending to crown Cleopatra as queen over Rome itself. These accusations, whether true or exaggerated, resonated with Roman fears of monarchy and foreign domination. The donations of Alexandria also sharpened the rivalry between Antony and Octavian into an open contest for supremacy. Both men knew that a final confrontation was inevitable. Cleopatra's role in this conflict was now central. She was not merely Antony's lover. She was his partner in an alternative vision of empire. Where Octavian claimed to defend the Roman Republic, Antony and Cleopatra presented themselves as divine rulers of a new order. Despite the storm brewing in Rome, Cleopatra remained confident. In Alexandria, she continued to rule with authority, expanding her building projects, supporting trade, and maintaining Egypt's prosperity. Her image as Isis was stronger than ever, and her people saw her as the embodiment of Egypt's greatness. For Cleopatra, the donations of Alexandria were not reckless. They were the culmination of years of strategy. She had secured alliances, borne heirs, and woven her dynasty into the fate of Rome. Yet the donations also exposed the limits of her position. By publicly challenging Octavian's authority, Cleopatra ensured that Rome's hostility toward her would reach its peak. The stage was set for a clash that could end only in victory for one side and destruction for the other. In the next segment, we will explore how Octavian escalated his campaign against Antony and Cleopatra, the political maneuvering in Rome, and the path that led inexorably toward the great confrontation at Octavium. By 34 BCE, after the donations of Alexandria, Cleopatra had reached the height of her power. Her children were proclaimed rulers of vast territories. Her son Caesarion was publicly declared the heir of Julius Caesar, and she herself stood at the center of a vision that blended Egyptian divinity with Roman conquest. Yet this triumph also marked the beginning of the end. In Rome, Octavian seized upon the spectacle to launch a relentless campaign against both Antony and Cleopatra, shaping them into villains in the eyes of the Roman people. Octavian was a master of propaganda. Though young, he was shrewd, disciplined, and ruthless. He understood that wars were not won only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of citizens. Antony's actions in Alexandria gave him the perfect material. Octavian portrayed Antony as a Roman who had abandoned his heritage, surrendering to a foreign queen. Cleopatra, he said, had ensnared Antony with luxury and lust, leading him to betray his duties to Rome. Pamphlets circulated accusing Antony of planning to make Alexandria the new capital of the empire. He was said to have promised Cleopatra dominion over Rome itself, a shocking idea to Romans who still valued their republic, even as it was dissolving. The image of Cleopatra as a dangerous, manipulative seductress spread quickly, and Antony's Roman supporters found it harder to defend him. At the same time, Octavian carefully positioned himself as the defender of Roman tradition. He emphasized his role as Caesar's adopted son and heir, contrasting it with Antony's recognition of Caesarion. Octavian argued that Caesarion was illegitimate and that Antony's attempt to elevate him was a direct challenge to Caesar's will. This claim struck at the heart of Roman politics because it framed Antony and Cleopatra as enemies not only of Octavian, but of Caesar's legacy. In Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared for the coming conflict. She and Antony were now inseparable in politics and war. Their children symbolized their dynastic ambitions, and their rule was framed as divinely sanctioned. Cleopatra was Isis, Antony was Dionysus. Their court in Alexandria celebrated them as rulers of a new world order. Yet Cleopatra was no naive dreamer. She understood the scale of the threat Octavian posed, and she devoted Egypt's resources to supporting Antony's cause. Egypt provided Antony with ships, grain, and treasure. Its wealth was essential, for Octavian controlled the West and could call upon Italy's manpower. Antony's strength lay in the East, where Cleopatra's resources were the foundation of his military power. This dependence on Egypt gave Cleopatra unusual influence. She was not simply supporting Antony. She was shaping his strategy, guiding his policies, and ensuring that Egypt's interests were tied to his success. Meanwhile, in Rome, tensions boiled over. In 32 BCE, Antony divorced Octavia, Octavian's sister. This act destroyed any chance of reconciliation between the two men. Octavian used it to inflame public opinion further, claiming that Antony had insulted a virtuous Roman woman for the sake of a foreign queen. The Senate, swayed by Octavian's speeches and by the fear of Cleopatra's influence, declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. This clever framing turned the conflict into a patriotic struggle against a foreign enemy, rather than another Roman civil war. For Cleopatra, this declaration was both a threat and a strange advantage. By making her the official enemy, Octavian acknowledged her central role. She was no longer just the consort of Antony, but the recognized leader of the opposing side. It was a dangerous position, but also one that confirmed the power she had achieved. Few women in history had ever been cast as such prominent players in Rome's wars. In preparation for battle, Cleopatra personally oversaw Egypt's contributions. Ancient sources note her presence at naval preparations, financial planning, and strategy discussions. She was not content to be a passive supporter. She commanded resources, gave orders, and stood beside Antony as a partner in leadership. Her ships designed in Egyptian shipyards would play a decisive role in the conflict to come. Yet, cracks were beginning to show. Antony's Roman allies were uneasy about Cleopatra's influence. Some resented her presence in councils of war, seeing it as un-Roman. Others doubted her motives, suggesting she sought only to protect Egypt rather than to defend Antony's Roman interests. Octavian exploited these suspicions, spreading stories that Cleopatra's goal was to rule Rome through Antony, turning him into her puppet. Despite the growing hostility, Cleopatra remained committed. She had tied her fate to Antony completely, and the future of her dynasty depended on their victory. Caesarion, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, all of them could inherit vast kingdoms if Antony triumphed. But if Octavian prevailed, their future and hers would be destroyed. The war moved steadily toward a decisive confrontation. Fleets were assembled, armies marched, and diplomats sought alliances. Antony and Cleopatra concentrated their forces in Greece, where they planned to face Octavian's navy. Octavian, meanwhile, prepared his propaganda for the Roman people, framing the coming battle not as civil war, but as a defense of Rome against a foreign queen. Thus, Cleopatra's destiny and Egypt's fate were about to be decided on the waters off the western coast of Greece. The world watched as two visions clashed: Octavian's disciplined Roman order against Antony and Cleopatra's cosmopolitan divine monarchy. In the next segment, we will turn to the preparations for the Battle of Actium, the strategies on both sides, and how Cleopatra became directly involved in what would prove the defining conflict of her life. By 32 BCE, the rivalry between Octavian on one side and Antony with Cleopatra on the other had reached its final phase. Rome could not remain divided forever. The propaganda, the accusations, the betrayals, everything pointed toward one decisive confrontation. That confrontation would come at Actium, a naval battle fought off the western coast of Greece. Before the fleets clashed, however, Years of preparation, maneuvering, and tension built up to the moment that would decide Cleopatra's fate and the future of Egypt. The stage for the conflict was set when the Roman Senate, guided by Octavian, declared war not on Antony but on Cleopatra. This was a calculated move. By framing the war as Rome versus a foreign queen, Octavian turned Antony into a man who had betrayed his people for a woman. It was a clever stroke of political theater, giving Octavian the moral high ground and unifying Romans against what he painted as an external threat. Cleopatra's image as Isis, queen of kings and divine mother, made for powerful propaganda in Alexandria, but in Rome it was twisted into a symbol of danger and corruption. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. Antony commanded a vast fleet, supported heavily by Egypt. Cleopatra personally supplied around 200 ships, many larger and heavier than Roman vessels, equipped for carrying supplies and soldiers. These ships reflected Egypt's wealth and shipbuilding capacity, but their size would prove both a strength and a weakness. Antony's overall fleet numbered about 500 warships, while Octavian, under the command of his Admiral Agrippa, controlled a smaller but more maneuverable force of about 400. Antony and Cleopatra also had a large army on land, numbering tens of thousands, but they faced serious challenges. Octavian's general, Agrippa, had already captured key positions along the coast, cutting off Antony's supply lines. Disease spread among Antony's troops, morale weakened, and defections began to occur. Octavian's propaganda reached into Antony's own camp, persuading some commanders that their general was no longer fighting for Rome, but for Cleopatra's ambitions. Cleopatra, however, remained fully involved. She commanded her own squadron and contributed financially and strategically to the war effort. Ancient sources note that she was present in councils of war, her opinions heard alongside Antony's. This participation scandalized Roman critics, but demonstrated her role as a partner, not a passive figure. To her, the stakes were clear. If Antony won, her dynasty would flourish. If he lost, everything she had built would vanish. The decision to fight at Actium was controversial. Antony's land forces outnumbered Octavian's, and some of his generals urged him to march inland, where he could defeat Octavian's smaller army in a decisive battle. But Antony, influenced perhaps by Cleopatra's naval investment or by his own pride in his fleet, chose to risk everything on a naval engagement. This choice would prove fateful. In September of 31st BCE, the two fleets finally faced each other at Actium. The scene was immense. Hundreds of ships stretching across the Ionian Sea. Their sails lowered, their oarsmen ready, soldiers armed for combat on the decks. Antony's massive Egyptian-backed vessels loomed impressively, but Agrippa's lighter, more agile ships had the advantage of speed. As the battle began, Octavian's fleet moved skillfully, darting in and out to harass Antony's slower ships. Cleopatra commanded her own squadron, stationed behind Antony's line. Ancient writers disagree on her role. Some say she stayed back to protect her treasure, others that she was prepared to act if the tide turned. What is certain is that she was present, not hidden away in Alexandria, but directly involved in the most decisive battle of her time. As the fighting raged, Antony's forces struggled. His larger ships, difficult to maneuver, could not match Agrippa's tactics. Disorder spread through his line. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke from the battle and sailed south. Ancient accounts differ on why. Some suggest it was a prearranged plan, others that Cleopatra panicked and fled. Whatever the truth, Antony, upon seeing her ships depart, made the fateful decision to abandon the battle and follow her. With their commanders gone, Antony's remaining forces collapsed. His fleet was destroyed or captured. His army left stranded. Actium ended in a decisive victory for Octavian, sealing Antony and Cleopatra's downfall. What had begun as a contest of two great powers ended as a rout. For Octavian, Actium was the moment he secured his path to absolute rule. For Antony and Cleopatra, it was the beginning of the end. They retreated to Egypt, still alive, but with their power shattered. Cleopatra had gambled everything, her throne, her dynasty, her future, on Antony's victory. Now, with their defeat, she faced the prospect of Rome's vengeance. Yet Cleopatra did not surrender immediately. Back in Alexandria, she began preparing for one final stand. She stockpiled resources, fortified the city, and considered strategies for survival. Though weakened, she was not yet ready to abandon hope. For Cleopatra, survival had always depended on resilience and cunning, and she would not yield until the very end. In the next segment, we will follow Cleopatra and Antony as they retreat to Egypt, their power crumbling, their allies deserting them, and the shadow of Octavian's final invasion drawing ever closer. After the catastrophe at Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Egypt. The naval defeat had shattered their hopes of building a joint empire and left them dangerously exposed. Octavian's victory gave him command of the seas, and Antony's remaining supporters began to abandon him. Yet Cleopatra did not immediately surrender. Instead, she returned to Alexandria, the heart of her kingdom, and prepared for what she knew would be a desperate final phase of her reign. The retreat itself was harrowing. Cleopatra's squadron, followed by Antony, sailed southward toward Egypt, carrying what treasure and resources they could salvage. Behind them, Antony's remaining forces collapsed. His soldiers and sailors, left leaderless, either surrendered to Octavian or scattered in despair. The once mighty fleet that had sailed into Octavian was gone. Still, Antony and Cleopatra clung to one another and to the hope that Alexandria could provide them with a chance to recover. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra acted quickly. She stockpiled grain, fortified Alexandria, and secured treasure in hidden vaults. She also began exploring possible escape routes. One plan was to move her fleet across the Isthmus of Suez into the Red Sea, from where she could sail south and establish a new base of power in Arabia or even India. But this plan was thwarted when Nabatean Arabs, allies of Octavian, destroyed her ships before they could launch. With this option gone, Cleopatra's hopes narrowed to defending Alexandria or negotiating directly with Octavian. Antony, meanwhile, was a shadow of his former self. The defeat at Actium had broken his prestige, and many of his allies deserted him. Once celebrated as a great Roman general, he now found himself mocked as Cleopatra's consort, accused of abandoning Roman honor for Egyptian luxury. His Roman soldiers, increasingly disillusioned, began to defect to Octavian. Cleopatra remained loyal, but the balance of their partnership had shifted. Where once Antony had seemed the dominant figure, now Cleopatra's determination and resources sustained their resistance. In Alexandria, the atmosphere grew tense. Cleopatra continued her role as queen, appearing in temples and issuing decrees, but everyone knew that Octavian's invasion was only a matter of time. Some of her advisors urged surrender, others urged escape. Cleopatra herself began negotiating in secret, sending envoys to Octavian to test whether she might secure Egypt's independence by offering him wealth or even herself as an ally. These negotiations were delicate. Cleopatra knew that Octavian's true aim was absolute power, but she hoped her famed charm and intelligence might still sway him, as they once had Caesar and Antony. Antony, however, was increasingly isolated. His attempts to rally his forces were half-hearted, and his authority was eroded by Cleopatra's direct negotiations. Ancient writers suggest that Cleopatra even considered betraying Antony to Octavian if it meant saving her children and her throne. Whether this was a serious plan or simply rumor, it reflected the desperation of the moment. For Cleopatra, survival of her dynasty was always the priority, even if it required sacrifice. In 30 BCE, Octavian advanced into Egypt. His legions marched swiftly, meeting little resistance. Antony attempted to rally his remaining troops for one last stand near Alexandria, but morale was low. Many soldiers defected as Octavian's forces approached. Cleopatra retreated into her mausoleum, a grand tomb she had constructed for herself in advance. She filled it with treasure, signaling that she was prepared to end her life rather than be paraded in Rome as a captive. The final days of Antony's life were marked by despair. When Octavian entered Alexandria, Antony's remaining forces surrendered. Misled by a false report that Cleopatra had taken her own life, Antony fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra's side, where he died in her arms. It was a tragic end for a man who had once commanded Rome's armies and dreamed of ruling half the known world. For Cleopatra, Antony's death was both a personal loss and the collapse of her last defense. Cleopatra was now alone against Octavian. She met with him face to face, hoping to secure mercy for her children and perhaps preserve Egypt in some form. Ancient accounts describe her attempts to charm him, appearing before him in her finest attire and speaking with eloquence. Octavian, however, was unmoved. He admired her composure, but was determined to eliminate all rivals. He intended to bring her back to Rome as a prisoner, to display her in his triumph before the Roman people. Cleopatra understood what this meant. To be paraded in chains through Rome, mocked by crowds, was a humiliation she would not accept. She began preparing for her final act, arranging her affairs, ensuring her children were provided for, and securing her legacy as she saw fit. Though she could not defeat Octavian militarily, she still held control over the manner of her end. The fall of Alexandria in 30 BCE marked the end of Ptolemaic independence. For nearly 3 centuries, Cleopatra's dynasty had ruled Egypt as heirs of Alexander the Great. Now, with Octavian's victory, Egypt would become a Roman province, its wealth absorbed into the empire. Cleopatra's reign, filled with ambition, spectacle, and resilience, had reached its final chapter. In the next segment, we will turn to Cleopatra's last days, her final meeting with Octavian, her preparations for death, and the legendary manner in which she chose to end her life rather than submit to Rome's triumph. With Antony gone and Octavian in control of Alexandria, Cleopatra's fate was sealed. Yet even in defeat, she refused to be reduced to a powerless captive. The days that followed were marked by calculated decisions, quiet acts of defiance, and the crafting of her final image. Cleopatra's last chapter would not be written by Octavian, but by herself. After Antony's suicide, Cleopatra withdrew into the mausoleum she had constructed for her own burial. The tomb was filled with treasure, gold, silver, jewels, and fine garments, symbols of her reign and of Egypt's wealth. By retreating into this space, she signaled that she was prepared to end her life on her own terms. Octavian, recognizing the danger of her suicide, placed guards around her to prevent her from carrying it out. He wanted her alive, for his greatest political triumph would be parading her through Rome in chains. Cleopatra, however, had no intention of allowing herself to be humiliated. She had seen how defeated kings and queens were treated in Roman triumphs. They were paraded before jeering crowds, chained and mocked, before being executed or imprisoned. For a queen who had presented herself as Isis, goddess of Egypt, such an end was unthinkable. Her dignity and her legacy depended on denying Octavian this spectacle. In her final meetings with Octavian, Cleopatra attempted to negotiate. She sought mercy for her children, especially Caesarion, whose life was in immediate danger. Octavian, though outwardly respectful, gave little away. He reassured her, but made no binding promises. Cleopatra, skilled at reading men, likely understood that Caesarion's position was hopeless. Octavian could not allow Caesar's biological son to live, for his existence undermined Octavian's own claim as Caesar's heir. Still, Cleopatra took what steps she could to protect her dynasty. She arranged for her younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, to be cared for. In time, Octavian would bring them to Rome, where they were raised in the household of his sister Octavia. For Cleopatra, ensuring their survival, even as hostages, was a final act of maternal duty. Her preparations for death were deliberate. Ancient writers describe her bathing, adorning herself in royal robes, and feasting one last time with her attendants. She wanted her end to reflect her life, regal, composed, and symbolic. The details of her death remain debated, but the most enduring account is that she arranged for an asp, a venomous snake, to be smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs. Allowing the serpent to bite her, she embraced an Egyptian symbol of royalty and divine power, for the cobra was associated with the goddess Wadjet, protector of the pharaohs. Other accounts suggest she may have used poison, concealed in a hairpin or ointment. Methods less dramatic, but equally effective. Regardless of the exact manner, what mattered was the image. Cleopatra chose death over submission, aligning her end with Egypt's symbols of sovereignty. She died in August of 30 BCE, at about 39 years of age, in the company of her loyal attendants. When Octavian received word of her death, he was reportedly frustrated, but also impressed. She had denied him the crowning glory of his triumph, refusing to be displayed as a prisoner. Instead, she became a figure of legend, remembered not as a captive queen, but as a ruler who chose her own fate. Antony was buried alongside her, their bodies laid together in Alexandria, uniting them in death as they had been in life. With Cleopatra's passing, Egypt's independence ended. Octavian annexed the kingdom, transforming it into a Roman province. Its immense wealth flowed into Rome, funding Octavian's rise to supreme power. The conquest of Egypt became the foundation of his new authority, and in 27 BCE, he would be granted the title Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Cleopatra's death, then, was not only the end of a dynasty, but also the beginning of the Roman Empire. Caesarion, her eldest son, and the child of Julius Caesar, met a grim fate. Though Cleopatra had tried to protect him, Octavian ordered his death soon after her suicide. The reasoning was simple. Too many Caesars is not good, as one ancient writer summarized. By eliminating Caesarion, Octavian secured his claim as Caesar's sole heir. Cleopatra's younger children, by Antony, were spared, raised in Rome under Octavia's care, but their future as rulers was gone. Cleopatra's final act ensured that she would be remembered as more than a victim. She had lived as a queen, styled herself a goddess, and died with dignity intact. Her refusal to bow to Rome's triumph preserved her legacy as a ruler of strength, cunning, and independence. Even her enemies, who had spent years portraying her as a manipulator and seductress, acknowledged the composure and resolve with which she faced her end. Thus ended the life of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her death closed the book on 3,000 years of pharaonic rule, a line that had stretched back to the dawn of civilization along the Nile. With her, the age of independent Egypt ended forever, absorbed into the Roman world. Yet her story did not fade. Instead, it became myth, reshaped through centuries of retelling, always carrying the image of a queen who defied empires and chose her own fate. In the next segment, we will look at the immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death, how Octavian consolidated his power, how Egypt was transformed under Roman rule, and how the memory of Cleopatra began to evolve even in the years just after her fall. With Cleopatra gone, the curtain fell on Egypt's independence. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries since Alexander the Great's conquest, was finished. In August of 30 BCE, Octavian stood as the undisputed master of both Rome and Egypt. The death of Cleopatra was not just the end of a queen, it was the reshaping of the Mediterranean world. Octavian's reaction to Cleopatra's suicide was mixed. On one hand, he had been denied the theatrical triumph of displaying her alive in Rome. A chained Cleopatra, paraded before the crowds, would have been a potent symbol of his victory over both Antony and Egypt. On the other hand, her dramatic death ensured that she could never again pose a threat. Octavian may have respected her resolve, but he also understood the opportunity her end gave him. He now had the wealth of Egypt at his disposal, wealth that would secure his transformation into Rome's first emperor. One of his first acts was to secure Alexandria. The city, which had resisted briefly, was brought under Roman control. Antony and Cleopatra were buried together, as Cleopatra had arranged, in a mausoleum within the city. Though Octavian denied them victory, he granted them burial honors, perhaps out of a desire to show magnanimity, or perhaps because Cleopatra's legend had already become too powerful to ignore. Octavian also turned his attention to Cleopatra's children. Caesarion, the eldest, represented the greatest threat to his rule. As the biological son of Julius Caesar, Caesarion carried a legitimacy that Octavian could never fully erase. Though Cleopatra had sent him away during the final days, hoping to save him, Caesarion was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. The justification was simple. Rome could not tolerate another Caesar. With Caesarion's death, Octavian eliminated his most dangerous rival. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. They were brought to Rome and placed under the care of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister. This act not only displayed Octavian's clemency, but also served as propaganda. By raising Cleopatra's children in his family's household, Octavian showed himself as the benevolent victor, even as he stripped them of their thrones. In time, Cleopatra Selene would marry King Juba II of Mauritania, carrying her mother's legacy into North Africa. For Rome, the conquest of Egypt was transformative. The kingdom became a Roman province, governed directly by officials loyal to Octavian. Egypt's vast grain supply was diverted to Rome, ensuring the city's food security and strengthening Octavian's hold on power. Its wealth of treasure funded Octavian's political programs, public works, and military pay. Egypt was no longer the independent jewel of the Mediterranean. It was now the personal possession of Rome's ruler. In 29 BCE, Octavian celebrated his triumph in Rome. Though Cleopatra could not be present, her image was displayed in art, pageants, and spoils. Statues, treasures, and exotic animals from Egypt paraded through the streets. Effigies of Cleopatra and Antony, dressed as they had appeared in Alexandria, were carried before the crowds as symbols of Octavian's victory. Even in death, Cleopatra's presence shaped the spectacle. She was the defeated queen, the embodiment of Rome's triumph over foreign decadence. The people of Rome responded with awe. The conquest of Egypt was not just another victory. It was the capstone of Octavian's rise. He had defeated his rivals, eliminated threats, and brought the wealthiest kingdom of the ancient world under Roman rule. For many Romans, Cleopatra became a cautionary tale, the foreign queen who seduced great men and brought them to ruin. Antony, once celebrated as Caesar's right hand, was remembered as the general who betrayed Rome for love of an Egyptian queen. Yet even as propaganda painted Cleopatra in negative colors, her legend began to grow. Stories of her intelligence, charm, and dramatic death spread throughout the Mediterranean. While Octavian wanted her remembered as a defeated enemy, many could not forget her presence as a queen who had stood against Rome until the end. Writers and poets began to shape her into a figure of fascination, part villain, part heroine, always unforgettable. In Egypt, life under Roman rule changed swiftly. The pharaohs were gone, and the temples no longer saw their monarch as divine. Instead, Roman officials governed, collecting taxes and ensuring grain shipments to Rome. The Egyptian people, who had seen Cleopatra as Isis incarnate, now lived under distant rulers who did not share their traditions. Alexandria remained a great city of trade and learning, but its autonomy was gone. It was no longer the capital of an independent kingdom, but a jewel in the Roman crown. For Octavian, Cleopatra's defeat became central to his narrative. He positioned himself as the savior of Rome, the man who had defeated the corruption of the East and restored Roman virtue. In 27 BCE, a few years after Cleopatra's death, he was granted the title Augustus, becoming the first emperor of Rome. The empire that would endure for centuries was built in part on the conquest of Egypt and the end of Cleopatra's reign. Thus, the immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death was both an end and a beginning. It ended 3,000 years of pharaonic rule, extinguished the Ptolemaic dynasty, and silenced Egypt's independence. But it also began a new era in Roman history, the imperial age of Augustus. Cleopatra's legacy, though tarnished by propaganda, survived in memory, refusing to be erased even by the might of Rome. In the next segment, we will explore how Cleopatra's image was shaped in the years following her death, how Roman writers, poets, and politicians turned her into a symbol, and how her legend began to shift from history into myth. With Cleopatra dead and Egypt absorbed into the Roman Empire, her story might have ended in silence. But in truth, her death marked the beginning of her transformation into legend. For centuries afterward, her memory was shaped not only by Egyptians who mourned the last pharaoh, but also, and most powerfully, by Romans who used her image to serve their own narratives. The result was a figure both vilified and admired, remembered as much for myth as for reality. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, had every reason to control Cleopatra's legacy. His rise to supreme power rested in part on framing her as the enemy of Rome. To Romans, Antony had once been a respected general and ally of Caesar. For Octavian to justify Antony's defeat, he needed a villain who could explain Antony's downfall without casting Rome itself as divided. Cleopatra filled that role perfectly. She was foreign, she was wealthy, and she had dared to challenge Rome. In Roman propaganda, Cleopatra became the embodiment of Eastern decadence and corruption. Pamphlets and speeches described her as a temptress who seduced great men with luxury and desire. Antony, they claimed, had been enslaved by her charms, abandoning his Roman duty for feasts, riches, and passion. Cleopatra's Alexandria was painted as a city of excess, a place where Antony lost his discipline and his loyalty to Rome. This portrayal served Octavian well. By casting Cleopatra as the corrupter, He preserved Antony's memory as a great Roman, undone not by his own flaws, but by foreign influence. At the same time, Octavian appeared as the savior who rescued Rome from her grasp. The Senate's decision to declare war on Cleopatra rather than Antony in 32 BCE was a deliberate step in this narrative, and after her death, the story continued to unfold along the same lines. Yet even as propaganda vilified her, Cleopatra fascinated Roman writers and poets. They could not deny her intelligence, her charisma, and the drama of her final act. Poets like Horace and Propertius, writing in the early years of Augustus's reign, described her suicide as both tragic and noble. They acknowledged her courage in refusing to be humiliated, portraying her death as an act of dignity, even while celebrating her defeat as Rome's triumph. The image of Cleopatra as a woman of extraordinary presence endured. Ancient accounts emphasized that her allure lay not only in beauty, but in wit, voice, and charm. Plutarch, writing later, noted that her companionship was irresistible, that her conversation and character left deeper impressions than her appearance. This recognition kept her memory alive, not simply as a villain, but as a figure of power and magnetism. In Egypt, the memory of Cleopatra lingered differently. For many Egyptians, she had been the last pharaoh who embraced their traditions, spoke their language, and honored their gods. She had presented herself as Isis, mother and protector, and for her subjects, her death was the loss of more than a queen. It was the end of an era. The temples no longer saw a living pharaoh to perform rituals, and Roman governors, though powerful, did not embody divine kingship. Cleopatra's memory in Egypt became intertwined with nostalgia for independence. Over time, Cleopatra's image began to evolve beyond immediate politics. As the centuries passed, she became a subject of drama, art, and storytelling. Her life filled with romance, power, alliances with Caesar and Antony, and her dramatic death was irresistible material for writers. Historians, poets, and later dramatists all shaped her into different forms: the dangerous seductress, the tragic lover, the proud queen who defied Rome. The duality of her image is striking. On one side, Roman propaganda painted her as a threat, a foreign queen who nearly toppled Rome with her wiles. On the other side, later generations admired her as a woman who held her own against the greatest empire of her age, ruling with intelligence and determination until the very end. Both views kept her alive in memory, ensuring that she was never forgotten. Even Augustus himself could not entirely erase the fascination. Though he promoted her as an enemy, he also allowed her burial with Antony in Alexandria, a sign that her stature demanded respect, even in defeat. Cleopatra's story became part of Rome's story, woven into the narrative of how Augustus rose to become the first emperor. In this sense, Cleopatra lived on in the very foundation of the Roman Empire. Her transformation into legend began almost immediately after her death. Romans spoke of her dramatic entrance to Caesar, rolled in a carpet, her barge sailing to meet Antony at Tarsus, her banquets of unimaginable luxury, and her death by ass-palm. Whether or not these details were fully true mattered less than the image they created. Cleopatra had lived her life conscious of appearances and spectacle, and in death, her myth carried that same theatrical quality. In the next segment, we will follow this evolution further, tracing how later writers of Greece and Rome shaped Cleopatra's image, how her story moved from history into literature, and how the myth surrounding her began to overshadow the woman herself. In the years and decades following her death, Cleopatra's story did not fade quietly into the past. Instead, it was retold, reshaped, and magnified in the works of Roman and later Greek writers, who gave her a place in the literary and historical imagination far larger than life itself. These accounts preserved her memory for centuries, but they also colored it with biases, exaggerations, and interpretations that ensured the real Cleopatra would remain partly hidden behind myth. The earliest portrayals of Cleopatra in Roman literature reflected the political needs of Augustus, who had just secured his position as Rome's first emperor. Poets of his circle, such as Horace and Propertitius, framed Cleopatra as the great enemy who had threatened Rome but was ultimately defeated. In Horace's Odes, written just after her death, Cleopatra is described as a dangerous woman who dared to plot the downfall of Rome. Yet even in this hostile portrayal, Horace acknowledged her dignity in choosing suicide over capture. Her death, he wrote, was not one of a coward, but of a queen who refused humiliation. Thus, even in propaganda, Cleopatra was recognized for her courage. Propertius, another poet of the Augustan age, described her as a fatale monstrum, a deadly monster, casting her as an unnatural force who corrupted Antony. But again, the drama of her story made her unforgettable. Even as these writers condemned her, they elevated her into a figure of almost mythic stature, a woman who stood toe-to-toe with Rome itself. Historians also contributed to shaping her legacy. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, provided one of the most detailed accounts of Cleopatra's life in his Life of Antony. His portrayal was more balanced, though still influenced by Roman attitudes. He noted that her charm lay not simply in beauty, but in presence, intelligence, and wit. He described her ability to speak many languages, her skill in conversation, and the irresistible quality of her companionship. For Plutarch, Cleopatra was not a mere seductress, but a woman of extraordinary qualities who matched Antony in ambition and character. Dio Cassius, another Roman historian, emphasized her political cunning and her role in the downfall of Antony. His account reinforced the image of Cleopatra as a manipulator. But again, the very fact that she could influence events at such a scale kept her story alive. The Greeks, too, added to her legend. Writers of the Hellenistic tradition admired her as a queen who defended her kingdom against overwhelming odds. In their eyes, she represented the last flame of Greek power in Egypt, extinguished only by Rome's irresistible force. This dual identity, as both a Greek monarch and an Egyptian pharaoh, gave her story an unusual richness. Different cultures claimed her, each shaping her to fit their own perspectives. One of the most enduring myths from these ancient accounts was the story of her dramatic entrances, the famous tale of being smuggled to Caesar rolled in a carpet, or her arrival to Antony at Tarsus aboard a golden barge with purple sails and attendants dressed as cupids. Whether fully true or not, these stories captured the imagination of writers and audiences alike. They presented Cleopatra as a master of spectacle, a queen who understood the power of theater in politics. Another enduring element was her death. The asp, symbol of Egyptian royalty, became central to the legend. The image of Cleopatra allowing the serpent to strike her, embracing both death and divine symbolism, became one of the most powerful images of antiquity. Roman writers repeated it again and again, each time reinforcing the idea of Cleopatra as a woman who chose her own end with regal dignity. Through these writings, Cleopatra's story began to transcend history. She became a literary figure, a character in Rome's epic of triumph and moral struggle. To Romans, she was both a warning and a fascination, a woman who embodied the allure and danger of the East, yet who also commanded admiration for her courage and charisma. This shaping of her image in ancient literature laid the foundation for how later generations would remember her. Centuries later, when Renaissance dramatists and poets rediscovered these texts, they found in Cleopatra a figure ready-made for theater and legend. The Cleopatra of Shakespeare, for example, owes as much to Plutarch's colorful stories as to the real queen herself. But before we turn to her later reinvention, it is important to recognize how the ancient world saw her, as both villain and heroine, both seductress and sovereign, both destroyer of men and courageous queen. This complexity is what ensured that she would never be forgotten. In the next segment, we will trace how Cleopatra's legend was inherited by later cultures, particularly in medieval and Renaissance Europe, and how her story evolved from history into one of the most enduring myths of female power in the Western imagination. As centuries passed, the real Cleopatra grew more distant, her reign fading into the background of Roman history. Yet her image lived on, retold and reshaped by cultures far removed from the Nile Valley. In the medieval period, and even more dramatically, during the Renaissance, Cleopatra was rediscovered as a figure of fascination. She was reimagined not just as a queen of Egypt, but as a symbol of power, passion, and tragedy. During the Middle Ages, knowledge of Cleopatra came mainly through Roman sources preserved by scholars. Writers and chroniclers often portrayed her through the lens of morality tales. To some, she was a warning about the dangers of lust and foreign temptation, echoing the Augustan propaganda that had cast her as the corrupter of Antony. Yet even within these cautionary stories, her intelligence and dignity remained difficult to ignore. She was sometimes grouped with famous women of antiquity who had shaped the destinies of men, both admired and condemned for her influence. By the Renaissance, a new interest in classical texts brought Cleopatra's story back into the spotlight. Humanists rediscovered Plutarch and other ancient writers, and artists, poets, and dramatists found in Cleopatra a character rich with dramatic potential. She was at once regal and human, powerful yet vulnerable, ambitious yet tragic. This complexity made her ideal for the art and literature of the age. In visual art, Renaissance painters often depicted her death, the moment most celebrated in Roman accounts. Cleopatra with the asp became a recurring subject. Artists portrayed her in sumptuous settings, adorned with jewels and silks, her beauty undiminished even in death. These images emphasized both sensuality and tragedy, making her a figure of romantic martyrdom. For audiences of the Renaissance, she symbolized the eternal struggle between love and power, passion and duty. In literature, she found her most famous Renaissance voice in William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Drawing heavily from Plutarch's account, Shakespeare presented her as a queen of grandeur and unpredictability, whose love for Antony was both her strength and her downfall. In his play, Cleopatra is witty, commanding, and deeply human, capable of towering pride and tender vulnerability. Shakespeare's portrayal ensured that for English-speaking audiences, Cleopatra would forever be remembered as one of the most vivid female characters in theater. Other European dramatists also found inspiration in her story. In France, tragedies about Cleopatra emphasized her role as a noble queen who chose death over dishonor. In Italy, poets and playwrights highlighted her as a figure of passion and beauty. Across Europe, her image shifted away from Roman propaganda's villainy and toward a more sympathetic view, one that admired her courage and her dramatic end. The Renaissance fascination with Cleopatra was not only about her as a historical figure. She embodied broader themes that resonated deeply with the era: the tension between reason and emotion, the allure of power, and the tragedy of great love undone by politics. Her story allowed writers and artists to explore questions of destiny, choice, and the costs of ambition. Even as these retellings romanticized her, they also preserved echoes of the ancient debates. Was Cleopatra a manipulator who destroyed Antony, or a queen defending her realm against impossible odds? Was she a temptress or a strategist, a lover or a ruler? Renaissance audiences, like their Roman predecessors, found it impossible to reduce her to a single role. That ambiguity, rather than diminishing her, made her endlessly compelling. Her image also began to evolve in another way during this period, as a symbol of female agency. At a time when women's roles were restricted, Cleopatra represented a woman who stood at the center of history, shaping events through intelligence and will. While her story often ended in tragedy, her presence as a sovereign who challenged Rome itself offered a vision of female power that both fascinated and unsettled later generations. By the close of the Renaissance, Cleopatra had become more than a historical queen. She was a literary and artistic archetype, a character as much imagined as remembered. Her death by asp, her barge sailing to meet Antony, her witty exchanges all became set pieces of theater and painting, repeated again and again until they seemed more real than history itself. In the next segment, we will examine how Cleopatra's legend continued to grow in the modern era through Enlightenment thinkers, romantic artists, and eventually into the realms of film and popular culture, where she would become not only a queen of history, but one of the most recognizable icons of all time. By the time Europe entered the Enlightenment and Romantic eras, Cleopatra was no longer remembered simply as the last pharaoh of Egypt. She had become a figure of endless reinterpretation, her image molded to fit the values, fascinations, and anxieties of each new age. The historical queen, who had ruled Egypt with cunning and resilience, was increasingly overshadowed by the legendary Cleopatra of art, literature, and eventually popular culture. During the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, scholars revisited ancient texts with renewed interest in history and philosophy. Cleopatra's life was studied alongside that of Caesar and Antony, but the emphasis shifted. Rationalist writers often portrayed her as a case study in the dangers of passion overwhelming reason. To them, Antony's downfall under Cleopatra's influence illustrated what happened when emotion triumphed over duty. In this telling, Cleopatra was less a villain than a symbol of irresistible desire, the eternal force that could undo even the greatest men. Yet not all Enlightenment thinkers condemned her. Some admired her intelligence, her political acumen, and her ability to rule in a male-dominated world. Voltaire, for example, saw in her the qualities of a sovereign who faced extraordinary challenges. Even in critical accounts, there was respect for her ability to captivate and command. The ambiguity of her image, half cautionary tale, half admiration, remained intact. With the rise of Romanticism in the late 18th and 19th centuries, Cleopatra's legend took on new life. Romantic artists and poets were drawn to stories of passion, tragedy, and heroic defiance, and Cleopatra offered all three. Painters depicted her in dramatic scenes, reclining on her deathbed, the asp poised at her breast, or gazing defiantly as she prepared for her fate. These works emphasized emotion, grandeur, and spectacle, transforming her into a tragic heroine. In literature, Romantic writers cast Cleopatra as the ultimate figure of doomed love. Her affair with Antony became the central theme, a story of two great lovers destroyed by politics and fate. This interpretation softened the harsher Roman propaganda. Rather than a manipulative temptress, Cleopatra became a woman of deep feeling, undone by her devotion to Antony. Her choice of death was presented not only as a refusal of humiliation, but also as a final act of fidelity. The 19th century also saw Cleopatra emerge in popular imagination through theater and opera. She appeared as a character in grand productions that emphasized spectacle, lavish costumes, exotic settings, and dramatic endings. Her story fit perfectly into the 19th century fascination with the Orient, a romanticized vision of the East, filled with mystery and luxury. Cleopatra became an emblem of that fascination. Her Egypt depicted as a land of splendor and decadence. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt during this same period fueled renewed interest in her. European expeditions uncovered temples, statues, and artifacts that reminded the world of Egypt's grandeur. Though no definitive images of Cleopatra herself were found, the fascination with ancient Egypt cast her as its most famous representative. She became, in the eyes of many, the embodiment of a civilization that had dazzled the world for millennia. By the early 20th century, Cleopatra's story had moved seamlessly into modern media. Silent films depicted her as an exotic temptress, often exaggerating her allure with elaborate costumes and sets. Later, in Hollywood's golden age, she was immortalized in films such as the 1963 epic Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor. That production, famous for its scale and extravagance, reinforced Cleopatra's image as both a woman of immense beauty and a queen whose life was intertwined with grand spectacle. In popular culture, Cleopatra became less a historical ruler and more an icon. Her name evoked images of eyeliner, golden headdresses, and dramatic entrances. The real complexities of her reign, her administrative reforms, her linguistic talents, her careful diplomacy, were overshadowed by the legend of her seductions and her tragic end. Yet even this simplified image kept her alive in memory, ensuring she remained one of the most recognizable figures of the ancient world. Across Enlightenment debates, romantic art, and modern cinema, one theme remained constant. Cleopatra was never forgotten. Her story was retold, not because of the size of her armies or the length of her reign, but because of the extraordinary impression she made on history and imagination alike. She was the queen who stood against Rome, the woman who held the love of Caesar and Antony, and the figure who chose death over humiliation. In the next segment, we will return to the historical Cleopatra, separating legend from fact, and explore what the evidence tells us about her true reign, her policies, her strategies, and her lasting impact on Egypt itself, beyond the myths woven around her name. Having followed Cleopatra's journey into legend, we now return to the historical queen herself. Behind the layers of myth, propaganda, and dramatization lies the reality of a ruler who governed one of the most important kingdoms of the ancient world. To understand Cleopatra fully, we must set aside the theater of seduction and spectacle and look instead at the evidence of her reign, her policies, her strategies, and the ways she ensured Egypt's survival during an era of extraordinary danger. Cleopatra came to power in 51 BCE, at the age of 18, in a kingdom weakened by debt, famine, and dependence on Rome. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had drained Egypt's resources to bribe Roman officials for protection, leaving behind a fragile state. From the outset, Cleopatra faced the challenge of stabilizing Egypt while also managing the growing shadow of Roman intervention. That she not only survived, but ruled effectively for nearly 2 decades, speaks to her skill as a stateswoman. One of her greatest strengths was her ability to bridge cultures. Most Ptolemaic rulers had remained aloof from their Egyptian subjects, identifying themselves as Greek monarchs in an Egyptian land. Cleopatra was different. She was the first of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language and to present herself consistently as a pharaoh in the full tradition of the Nile. In temple inscriptions, she appears as the living embodiment of Isis, fulfilling the religious role expected of an Egyptian ruler. At the same time, in Alexandria, She governed as a Hellenistic queen, engaging with Greek scholars, philosophers, and diplomats. This dual identity gave her unusual legitimacy, allowing her to command loyalty from both the Greek elite and the Egyptian people. Economically, Cleopatra took steps to strengthen Egypt's position. Inscriptions and papyri suggest she reformed the taxation system, ensuring that the kingdom could meet Rome's demands while still maintaining internal stability. She supported agriculture by managing irrigation and grain production, crucial in a land where the Nile's annual flood determined prosperity. By carefully overseeing these systems, Cleopatra ensured that Egypt remained one of the wealthiest regions of the Mediterranean, even in times of crisis. Diplomatically, she demonstrated remarkable adaptability. When Julius Caesar entered Egypt, she seized the chance to ally with him, not simply for personal reasons, but because his support guaranteed her throne. Later, when Caesar was gone, she shifted her alliance to Antony, again choosing the Roman most capable of protecting Egypt's independence. These alliances were not passive affairs of romance. They were strategic decisions, rooted in the reality that Egypt could not resist Rome militarily and had to secure survival through partnership. Her foreign policy also reflected ambition beyond mere survival. Through Antony, she gained control of territories in Cyprus, Phoenicia, and beyond, expanding her influence outside Egypt's borders. By presenting her children as rulers of these lands during the donations of Alexandria, she signaled her vision of a dynasty that could rival Rome itself, though this vision ultimately failed. It reveals Cleopatra not as a queen clinging to power, but as a leader thinking on an imperial scale. Religious symbolism was another key to her rule. By presenting herself as Isis, Cleopatra tapped into centuries of Egyptian belief that the pharaoh was divine. She staged ceremonies, appeared in temples, and used art and coinage to reinforce this image. Coins minted during her reign often depict her with strong, defined features, an image of authority rather than passive beauty. These coins are some of the most direct evidence of how she wanted to be seen, not as a seductress, but as a sovereign. The reality of Cleopatra's reign also shows her as pragmatic and resilient. She faced multiple crises: the exile during her brother's rule, famine during her early reign, the political storms of Rome, and finally the disaster at Actium. In each case, she adapted. She raised armies when necessary, negotiated when possible, and never abandoned her throne until the very end. Her decision to die by suicide was not an act of despair alone, but a final assertion of control, denying Octavian the power to dictate her fate. The myth of Cleopatra as a woman who conquered men with beauty alone diminishes the truth of her achievement. Ancient sources, even those hostile to her, admit that her real strength was in her intellect, her presence, and her political skill. Plutarch wrote that her charm lay in conversation and character more than in looks, an observation that aligns with the evidence of her reign. She was a strategist, a linguist, a ruler who navigated one of the most dangerous periods in Egyptian history with extraordinary resilience. Her legacy for Egypt was profound, even if overshadowed by her dramatic death. She preserved Egyptian independence for nearly 20 years, beyond what might otherwise have been possible, keeping Rome at bay through diplomacy and alliance. She strengthened the economy, maintained cultural traditions, and ensured that Egypt remained a powerful and wealthy land until the very moment of its annexation. Cleopatra was, in the end, both the last of the pharaohs and the last of the Ptolemies. With her death, 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition ended. Yet her reign was not simply a coda. It was a final flowering of Egyptian sovereignty, embodied in a queen who refused to be forgotten. In the next segment, we will look more closely at Cleopatra's Egypt itself, the daily life of her subjects, the role of Alexandria as a cultural capital, and how her kingdom functioned during the last years of independence before it became part of the Roman world. To better understand Cleopatra's reign, we must look beyond palaces and battlefields to the land and people she governed. Egypt in the 1st century BCE was a kingdom with deep traditions, stretching back thousands of years, yet it was also a society transformed by centuries of Greek rule under the Ptolemies. Cleopatra inherited a land of contrasts, where farmers along the Nile followed rhythms as old as the pyramids, while the city of Alexandria stood as one of the most cosmopolitan centers of the Mediterranean. At the heart of Egyptian life was the Nile. Its annual flood determined the success or failure of the harvest. When the river rose and spread nutrient-rich silt across the fields, crops flourished, feeding both Egyptians and Rome. When the flood failed, famine followed. Cleopatra's reign coincided with a period of unpredictable flooding, which created hardship in her early years. Managing grain supplies was one of her chief responsibilities. Records show that she took direct measures to secure storage, regulate distribution, and ensure that her kingdom could both survive and pay its debts to Rome. Her ability to maintain stability during lean years was a mark of her competence as a ruler. The majority of Egypt's people were farmers who lived in rural villages along the Nile. Their lives were tied to the agricultural cycle, plowing and planting after the flood, tending crops through the growing season, and harvesting in the spring. They paid taxes in grain, which supported the state and fed the cities. Though their world was far from the splendor of Alexandria, they revered Cleopatra as their pharaoh. In temples across the land, she was depicted in traditional Egyptian style, offering to the gods as Isis reborn. For these people, she was not a foreign queen, but the living link between earth and heaven, responsible for the fertility of their fields and the prosperity of the land. Alexandria, by contrast, was a world of scholars, merchants, and political intrigue. Founded by Alexander the Great, it had grown into a metropolis where Greek culture dominated, but Egyptian, Jewish, and other communities flourished as well. It was a hub of trade, with ships arriving from across the Mediterranean and beyond, bringing goods such as wine, olive oil, spices, and papyrus. Its great harbor, watched over by the towering lighthouse of Pharaohs, connected Egypt to the wider world. Cleopatra's court was based here, and she used the city's wealth and learning as tools of diplomacy and governance. One of Alexandria's most remarkable institutions was its library, said to house hundreds of thousands of scrolls, while much of its collection was lost in antiquity. In Cleopatra's time, it still symbolized the city's role as a center of knowledge. Scholars in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy worked under royal patronage, and Cleopatra herself was educated in this environment. Her familiarity with science and literature reflected the intellectual climate of Alexandria, making her unusual among rulers of her age. Economically, Cleopatra's reign required balancing the demands of Rome with the prosperity of Egypt. Taxes were heavy, particularly because her father's debts had left the kingdom beholden to Roman financiers. Cleopatra negotiated carefully, sending tribute when necessary, but also ensuring that Egypt retained enough resources to function. Her alliance with Antony later allowed her to expand her territory and wealth, giving her more independence. Her ability to manage finances was part of what kept her on the throne for nearly 20 years, even as Rome swallowed other kingdoms. Culturally, Cleopatra's Egypt was a fusion of Greek and Egyptian traditions. In Alexandria, Greek language, art, and customs dominated. Cleopatra herself was raised in this Hellenistic world, fluent in Greek philosophy and rhetoric. Yet in the countryside, Egyptian religion and traditions held sway. By adopting both identities, appearing as Isis in Egyptian temples, while ruling as a Greek monarch in Alexandria. Cleopatra embodied the dual nature of her kingdom. This adaptability helped her unify her diverse subjects under her rule. Daily life for Egyptians under Cleopatra varied greatly depending on class. Wealthy Greeks and Egyptians in Alexandria lived in villas with mosaics, courtyards, and luxuries brought from abroad. Merchants thrived on trade, while scholars debated in lecture halls. For ordinary Egyptians, life was harsher. Farmers labored in fields, fishermen worked the Nile, and craftsmen produced pottery, linen, and tools. Taxes weighed heavily. But the stability of Cleopatra's reign meant fewer disruptions than in the chaotic years before her rule. Religion played a central role in every aspect of life. Temples to Isis, Osiris, Horus, and other gods remained active, and festivals punctuated the year. Cleopatra's decision to associate herself with Isis resonated deeply. As Isis was the goddess of motherhood, magic, and protection, Cleopatra's image as the goddess on earth reinforced her authority and endeared her to her people. To Egyptians, her motherhood of Caesarion only deepened this symbolism, linking divine myth to living reality. In foreign affairs, Cleopatra leveraged Egypt's position at the crossroads of trade. The Nile Valley produced grain that was vital to Rome, while trade routes through the Red Sea connected Egypt to Arabia, Africa, and India. Cleopatra ensured that Egypt profited from these connections, strengthening her kingdom's role as a bridge between East and West. Despite the glamour of Alexandria and the prosperity of the Nile, Cleopatra's Egypt lived under the constant shadow of Rome. Every decision was shaped by the reality that Rome's legions could descend at any time. Cleopatra's brilliance lay in extending Egypt's independence as long as she did, navigating between appeasement and defiance with skill. Thus, life in Cleopatra's Egypt was a blend of the ancient and the new, the local and the foreign, the stable and the precarious. She presided over a kingdom rich in tradition and wealth, yet vulnerable to forces beyond its borders. By embracing both her Greek heritage and her Egyptian role, Cleopatra maintained unity in a diverse land during a period when survival itself was an achievement. In the next segment, we will explore Cleopatra's personal qualities more deeply. Her education, her linguistic talents, her leadership style, and the ways in which her contemporaries described her presence and influence. Having looked at Egypt under Cleopatra's rule, we now turn more closely to the woman herself. What qualities allowed her to endure and even thrive in such a perilous age? Ancient writers left vivid, if sometimes biased, descriptions of her character. From their accounts, combined with the evidence of her reign, we can piece together a portrait of Cleopatra as more than myth, a ruler of intelligence, resilience, and striking presence. Cleopatra was famously well educated. Growing up in Alexandria, she benefited from tutors associated with the city's tradition of scholarship. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Her linguistic ability was particularly remarkable. While most of her Ptolemaic predecessors relied on Greek alone, Cleopatra learned multiple languages. Ancient sources credit her with fluency in Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and other tongues spoken in neighboring lands. This ability to converse directly with diverse peoples without interpreters set her apart from her dynasty and deepened her legitimacy as queen. Her intellectual skill was matched by political acumen. From a young age, Cleopatra observed the brutal realities of palace politics. She knew that her throne could be taken not only by rivals in Rome, but also by her own family. This awareness sharpened her instincts. When forced into exile early in her reign, she raised her own army and fought back. When Julius Caesar arrived, she seized the opportunity to ally with him. Later, she did the same with Antony. Each time, she recognized the necessity of bold action and took risks that paid off, at least for a time. Plutarch, who wrote more than a century after her death, offered one of the most detailed descriptions of her presence. He emphasized that her charm lay not merely in beauty, but in her voice, her wit, and her conversation. He wrote that her companionship was irresistible, that her words carried a music and character that captivated those who heard her. This testimony aligns with what we know of her diplomatic style. She was persuasive, engaging, and able to form personal bonds with the most powerful men of her age. Her leadership style combined spectacle with pragmatism. Cleopatra understood the importance of image. Her theatrical entrances, being rolled in a carpet to meet Caesar, sailing in a barge adorned as a goddess to meet Antony, were not frivolous displays, but deliberate strategies. By presenting herself dramatically, she controlled first impressions, transforming encounters into memorable events that highlighted her power and charisma. At the same time, she worked behind the scenes to manage finances, agriculture, and diplomacy. She was both performer and administrator, queen and stateswoman. Cleopatra also embodied resilience. Her reign was a constant series of crises: family betrayal, famine, Roman civil wars, defeat at Actium. At each stage, she adapted. Even after Antony's death and her own capture, she negotiated with Octavian and prepared for her end with composure. Her refusal to be paraded as a prisoner was consistent with her lifelong insistence on controlling her own narrative. Religious symbolism was another tool she wielded effectively. By associating herself with Isis, she claimed divine status in the eyes of her people. This was not empty symbolism, but a political necessity in Egypt, where the pharaoh was expected to mediate between gods and humans. Cleopatra's embodiment of Isis resonated deeply, especially when she presented Caesarion as Horus, the divine child. This blending of mythology and monarchy strengthened her authority and gave her reign a sacred dimension. Her personal qualities also included shrewd calculation. While romance has dominated her legend, it is clear that her relationships with Caesar and Antony were political alliances as much as personal ones. She aligned with Caesar when he was the most powerful man in Rome, then with Antony when he controlled the East. These choices were pragmatic, designed to safeguard Egypt's independence. That they also became personal bonds speaks to her ability to combine emotion with strategy, weaving her life and politics together seamlessly. At the same time, Cleopatra inspired deep hostility among her enemies. Roman writers, reflecting Octavian's propaganda, painted her as a manipulative temptress who destroyed Antony. This hostility reveals the discomfort Romans felt toward a powerful foreign queen who influenced their leaders. In a society where women rarely held public power, Cleopatra's prominence was unsettling, yet the very intensity of the attacks against her shows how much she mattered. She was not a passive figure on the margins, but a central actor whose decisions shaped the course of Roman history. Cleopatra's talents extended to survival. Many Ptolemaic rulers before her had been assassinated or overthrown in palace intrigues. She navigated these dangers for nearly 20 years, maintaining control of her throne longer than many of her predecessors. That she held power at all, surrounded by enemies both domestic and foreign, is evidence of her skill. Her influence endured even after her death, because she was more than a queen tied to famous men. She was a ruler in her own right, remembered not only for her love affairs, but for her leadership. Coins minted during her reign show her with strong features, emphasizing authority rather than delicate beauty. These coins were propaganda in their own way, projecting the image of a queen who commanded respect. In the end, Cleopatra's character, combined intelligence, charm, resilience, and audacity. She was capable of spectacle, yet grounded in practical governance. She inspired devotion from her allies and fear from her enemies. While the myths around her often reduce her to a seductress, the reality is that she was one of the most capable monarchs of her era, navigating impossible circumstances with skill. In the next segment, we will explore the legacy of Cleopatra's dynasty, how the Ptolemies shaped Egypt during their centuries of rule, and how Cleopatra's reign both reflected and departed from the traditions of her family. To fully appreciate Cleopatra's reign, it is important to situate her within the longer history of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra did not emerge in isolation. She was the last in a line of rulers that stretched back nearly 3 centuries to the conquests of Alexander the Great. The traditions, achievements, and weaknesses of her dynasty shaped her circumstances, and her reign can be understood both as a continuation of that legacy and as a departure from it. The Ptolemies began with Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's generals, who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. Unlike other successors of Alexander, who ruled more loosely over conquered territories, Ptolemy established a stable and lasting dynasty in Egypt. He founded Alexandria as the new capital, a city designed to embody Greek order and culture, while also taking advantage of Egypt's strategic position for trade. For centuries, the Ptolemies ruled as Greek monarchs in an Egyptian land, maintaining their power by blending Hellenistic governance with pharaonic traditions. Under the early Ptolemies, Egypt flourished. The wealth of the Nile supported grand building projects, scientific inquiry, and the arts. The great library of Alexandria became a symbol of intellectual ambition, drawing scholars from across the world. Temples were restored and expanded, reinforcing the dynasty's role as guardians of Egyptian religion. The Lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood as a beacon of Ptolemaic pride. Yet, alongside these achievements came instability. The Ptolemies were notorious for family rivalries, with brothers and sisters often turning on one another. Incestuous marriages were common, intended to preserve dynastic purity, but also breeding conflict. Palace intrigues frequently erupted into assassinations and civil wars. This culture of suspicion and violence shaped the environment into which Cleopatra was born. She understood from the start that survival required cunning and vigilance. By the 2nd century BCE, the dynasty had begun to decline. Rome's power grew, and Egypt's independence became increasingly fragile. Ptolemaic rulers relied on bribes and alliances to preserve their thrones, draining the kingdom's resources. The grandeur of earlier centuries gave way to weakness and dependence. By the time Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Deucalides, sat on the throne, Egypt was deeply in debt to Rome and reliant on its protection. Cleopatra's reign thus began in a dynasty already weakened, its survival tied to Rome's goodwill. Yet she distinguished herself from her predecessors in several ways. While earlier Ptolemies had often remained culturally Greek, distant from their Egyptian subjects, Cleopatra embraced her Egyptian identity more fully. She presented herself in traditional Egyptian dress, spoke the Egyptian language, and associated herself with Isis. This was unusual among her family and gave her a broader base of legitimacy. In her political strategy, she was also more proactive than many of her predecessors. Whereas earlier rulers often reacted passively to Roman demands, Cleopatra sought to influence Rome directly by forming personal alliances with its most powerful leaders. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not mere accidents of romance, but deliberate strategies to secure Egypt's independence through Rome's own divisions. This approach, though risky, kept Egypt sovereign for nearly 2 decades after her father's reign, at a time when most other Hellenistic kingdoms had already fallen under Roman rule. Her vision for her dynasty was ambitious. Through the donations of Alexandria, she sought to place her children at the center of a revived Eastern Empire, with Caesarion as the heir of Caesar and her younger children ruling territories across the Mediterranean. This plan echoed the grandeur of the early Ptolemies, who had once dreamed of ruling beyond Egypt's borders. Though ultimately unsuccessful, it showed Cleopatra's determination to restore her dynasty to greatness rather than accept a diminished role under Rome. At the same time, her reign highlighted the contradictions of the Ptolemaic legacy. The dynasty had always balanced between Greek and Egyptian identities, between wealth and fragility, between grandeur and instability. Cleopatra embodied both the strengths and weaknesses of this heritage. She was learned, resourceful, and charismatic, carrying forward the intellectual and cultural ambitions of her ancestors. But she was also trapped by the same forces that had haunted her dynasty for generations: internal strife, dependence on Rome, and the impossibility of reconciling 2 very different cultures under one crown. Her death marked not only the end of her reign, but the end of the Ptolemaic line altogether. No successor followed her, and with Egypt's absorption into Rome, the dynasty founded by Ptolemy I vanished. Yet Cleopatra ensured that her legacy outshone those of her ancestors. Few outside academic circles remember the long line of Ptolemies who ruled before her. But Cleopatra's name endures, symbolizing both the glory and the tragedy of her dynasty's final chapter. Thus, Cleopatra's place in the Ptolemaic legacy is twofold. She was its culmination, embodying its blend of Greek and Egyptian identities, its brilliance in culture and spectacle, and its vulnerability to foreign domination. But she was also its exception, a ruler who rose above the mediocrity of many of her predecessors and made herself unforgettable. In her, the dynasty reached both its highest ambition and its final end. In the next segment, we will turn from dynastic history to Cleopatra's enduring legacy in Egypt itself, exploring how her reign affected Egyptian culture, religion, and identity in the centuries that followed, even under Roman rule. Though Cleopatra's reign ended in defeat and Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, her influence did not disappear with her death. In Egypt itself, her memory lingered, woven into religion, culture, and identity. For centuries after her passing, Egyptians remembered her as their last pharaoh, the queen who embraced their traditions more fully than most of her Macedonian Greek predecessors. One of Cleopatra's most lasting legacies in Egypt was her association with Isis. From the earliest years of her rule, she cultivated the image of herself as the goddess incarnate. Temple inscriptions show her making offerings in full pharaonic regalia, depicted alongside the gods in scenes echoing those of earlier Egyptian rulers. By linking herself to Isis, Cleopatra not only legitimized her rule, but also tapped into a powerful current of Egyptian belief. Isis was the divine mother, healer, and protector, beloved across all levels of society. Even after Cleopatra's death, temples continued to venerate Isis, and worshippers remembered the queen who had embodied her on earth. The cult of Isis spread beyond Egypt during the Roman era, finding followers in Greece, Italy, and even as far as Gaul. While Roman writers often painted Cleopatra in hostile colors, ordinary people across the empire encountered her indirectly through the enduring popularity of Isis. In this way, Cleopatra's religious legacy outlived her dynasty. The queen who had used Isis to strengthen her rule contributed to the goddess's survival as one of the most widely worshipped deities of the Roman world. Within Egypt, Cleopatra's reign was remembered as the final flowering of independence. Later generations, living under Roman governors, looked back on her era as a time when Egypt still had its own monarch, its own court, and its own dignity. Roman rule was efficient, but it was distant, impersonal, and focused primarily on extracting Egypt's wealth for Rome. Cleopatra, by contrast, had been a visible and active queen, speaking the Egyptian language, appearing in temples, and ruling as a divine pharaoh. That difference mattered to her subjects. Archaeological evidence of Cleopatra's reign reinforces this image. Coins minted under her authority show her not only in the Greek style of her dynasty, but also in forms recognizable to Egyptians. These coins circulated throughout her kingdom, carrying her image into towns and villages. For many Egyptians, this was how they knew their queen, a strong-featured ruler whose likeness symbolized stability. Such images reinforced her presence even far from Alexandria. Roman Egypt, by contrast, lacked this personal connection. Governors came and went, appointed by emperors far away. Temples continued to function, but they no longer had a living pharaoh to embody divine order. Cleopatra's death thus marked not only a political shift, but also a cultural rupture. For Egyptians, the pharaoh was more than a ruler. He or she was the axis between gods and people. With Cleopatra gone, that axis was broken, never to be restored. Despite this loss, her reign left subtle marks that endured under Roman administration. The blending of Greek and Egyptian identities, which she had embodied, persisted in art, language, and religious practice. Alexandria remained a vibrant center of scholarship and trade, its character shaped by the legacy of the Ptolemies. Even though Rome now controlled the kingdom, Cleopatra's memory lingered in the city's identity as a cultural crossroads. For the Egyptian people, Cleopatra's story became part of a broader narrative of resilience. Egypt had survived centuries of foreign rulers: the Persians, the Macedonians, and now the Romans. Cleopatra's embrace of Egyptian traditions symbolized a final moment when their pharaohs still recognized their gods and language. Later generations preserved that memory, not through official Roman accounts, but through the continuation of local religious practices and oral traditions. In a broader sense, Cleopatra's legacy in Egypt lies in the way she personified the endurance of Egyptian civilization itself. Even at the edge of its independence, Egypt produced a ruler of extraordinary ability, capable of influencing the greatest empire of the age. Her life and reign demonstrated that Egypt remained a land of power and significance, even as Rome absorbed it. This enduring legacy ensured that Cleopatra's name was remembered not only as a tragic figure in Roman propaganda, but also as a queen of Egypt, the last of a line stretching back to the earliest pharaohs. In this sense, her reign served as both an ending and a reminder of Egypt's unbroken history of kings and queens who had ruled for millennia. In the next segment, we will step back from Egypt itself and examine Cleopatra's place in the wider world, how her story influenced later views of women in power, and how she became a symbol for better and worse of female sovereignty and ambition across cultures. Beyond her immediate legacy in Egypt, Cleopatra's story took on broader meaning in the centuries that followed. She became more than a historical queen. She became a symbol of female sovereignty, ambition, and influence. Few women in antiquity held as much power as Cleopatra, and the memory of her reign shaped how later generations thought about women in positions of authority. In the ancient world, women were rarely rulers in their own right. Queens might serve as regents for their sons or as consorts to kings. But Cleopatra stood as a sovereign in her own name. She commanded armies, negotiated with foreign powers, and directed the resources of a wealthy kingdom. She did so not quietly, in the shadows, but openly and dramatically, presenting herself as Isis, appearing in councils of war, and aligning with Rome's most powerful men as an equal partner. This visibility was both her strength and the source of hostility. Roman propaganda turned her prominence into a weapon against her. Writers hostile to her influence framed her as a seductress who had corrupted Caesar and Antony, reducing powerful men to weakness. In doing so, they reflected the anxieties of a patriarchal society, uncomfortable with a woman exercising direct political authority. To Romans, Cleopatra was not only a foreign queen, but a challenge to their ideals of male dominance in politics. Yet, even in these hostile portrayals, her power was undeniable. The very intensity of the Roman reaction shows that Cleopatra mattered deeply. She was not dismissed or ignored. She was attacked precisely because she had influence at the highest levels. To later generations, this fact became central to her image, a woman who, despite prejudice and opposition, held her own in a world ruled by men. During the Renaissance and beyond, Cleopatra was often invoked as an example of the extremes of female power. Some saw her as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened when women pursued ambition too boldly. Others admired her as a figure of independence, a ruler who dared to confront Rome and die on her own terms. These competing views reflect the dual nature of her legacy, both feared and admired, condemned and celebrated. In the modern era, Cleopatra has increasingly been reclaimed as a symbol of agency rather than seduction. Historians emphasize her intelligence, her multilingualism, and her strategic thinking. Feminist writers see in her a woman who navigated impossible circumstances with resilience, using every tool available to her to protect her throne and her people. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony, once described as evidence of manipulation, are now more often understood as political necessities, chosen by a queen who had few alternatives in a world dominated by Rome. Cleopatra's image as a symbol of female power also extends into popular culture. In literature, theater, and film, she is often depicted as a commanding presence who shapes the destiny of men and empires. While these portrayals sometimes exaggerate her beauty or dramatize her romances, they continue to reinforce the idea of Cleopatra as a woman who stood at the center of history. Her story also speaks to the broader challenges faced by women in leadership. Like many powerful women across history, she was judged not only for her policies and actions, but for her relationships and personal life. Male rulers of her age could pursue alliances and marriages without criticism, but Cleopatra's choices were cast as manipulations. This double standard has persisted across centuries, making her story resonate with ongoing debates about gender and power. Cleopatra's enduring allure lies in her ability to defy simple categorization. She was both a monarch and a mother, a strategist and a symbol, a woman who embodied divine power and human vulnerability. Her life illustrates the possibilities and perils of female authority in a patriarchal world. That she remains one of the most famous women in history is itself evidence of the impact she had, transcending the limits placed upon her by her age. In the next segment, we will examine Cleopatra's legacy, not just as a queen or a symbol of gender, but as a figure of cross-cultural connection. A ruler who stood at the intersection of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman worlds, embodying the blending of civilizations that defined her era. Cleopatra's reign was remarkable, not only because she stood out as a woman in power, but also because she embodied the meeting point of three great civilizations: Egyptian, Greek, and Roman. Her life and legacy cannot be understood in isolation from this wider context. She was, in every sense, a queen between worlds, bridging cultures that had shaped the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. Her dynasty itself was a product of cultural fusion. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks, descended from Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. For nearly 3 centuries, they ruled Egypt as Greek monarchs, governing from Alexandria while presenting themselves in Egyptian temples as pharaohs. Most of her ancestors, however, leaned heavily toward their Greek identity, speaking little or no Egyptian, and remaining somewhat removed from the broader population. Cleopatra broke this pattern. She spoke Egyptian fluently and adopted the role of pharaoh more fully than her predecessors, presenting herself as the living Isis. In doing so, she connected with her subjects in ways her ancestors had not. At the same time, she was thoroughly Hellenistic in her education and outlook. She studied philosophy, science, and rhetoric in the Alexandrian tradition. She engaged with Greek scholars and styled herself in coinage and art according to Greek norms of kingship. Her reign thus represented the continuation of Greek culture in Egypt, even as she also embraced native traditions. This duality was at the heart of her power. She could move between cultures, addressing her Egyptian subjects in their language, while negotiating with Greek and Roman statesmen in theirs. Her ties to Rome added a third dimension. Rome was the rising superpower of the Mediterranean, and Cleopatra's survival depended on her ability to navigate its shifting politics. By allying with Julius Caesar, and later Mark Antony, she inserted herself directly into Rome's struggles for power. Her relationships with them were not simply personal, they were cross-cultural partnerships that bound Egypt to Rome's destiny. Through Caesarion, she linked her dynasty to the blood of Caesar himself, and through her children with Antony, she tied Egypt to one of Rome's most powerful families. This position between worlds was both her strength and her vulnerability. It allowed her to wield influence across cultural boundaries, but it also exposed her to attack from those who saw her as too foreign or too ambitious. Roman propaganda exploited this tension, portraying her as an Eastern queen who threatened Rome's values. Yet her ability to operate across these spheres was exactly what made her so effective as a ruler. Alexandria itself symbolized this intersection of cultures. It was a Greek-founded city on Egyptian soil, filled with temples, libraries, theaters, and docks that connected it to the wider world. It was home to Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and people from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra ruled from this cosmopolitan capital, drawing strength from its wealth and diversity. Her reign was a reflection of Alexandria itself, a blend of traditions, ideas, and peoples. In her religious role, too, Cleopatra bridged worlds. As Isis, she drew upon the deep traditions of Egyptian spirituality. As Dionysus's consort alongside Antony, she engaged with Greek religious imagery. As the consort of Caesar, honored in the Temple of Venus Genetrix in Rome, she entered Roman sacred space. Few rulers of her time could claim such a wide-ranging religious presence, spanning 3 civilizations. Even in her death, Cleopatra symbolized cultural convergence. The asp, associated with Egyptian royalty, became her final emblem. Yet the story of her suicide spread through Roman literature, shaped by Roman values and fears. Greek dramatists later retold it with their own themes of tragedy and heroism. From the beginning, her life and death were interpreted differently by different cultures, each projecting onto her their own ideas of power, love, and downfall. In this way, Cleopatra stands as one of the most cosmopolitan figures of antiquity. She was not confined to one culture or identity, but moved fluidly among them. Her reign illustrates the interconnectedness of the Mediterranean world in the 1st century BCE, when Egypt, Greece, and Rome were no longer separate spheres, but overlapping parts of a single contested world order. This ability to embody multiple identities also explains her enduring fascination. She can be claimed as an Egyptian pharaoh, a Greek monarch, a Roman consort, or a universal symbol of power and passion. Each culture that remembers her emphasizes a different aspect, yet all recognize her as extraordinary. In the next segment, we will look at Cleopatra's place in world history more broadly, considering how her reign and her legend connect to themes of empire, identity, and the ways in which individuals shape the fate of civilizations. As we near the conclusion of Cleopatra's story, it is worth stepping back to ask what her life means in the broader sweep of world history. She was, after all, the last ruler of an independent Egypt, the partner of Rome's most powerful men, and a queen whose legend has outlasted most of her contemporaries. Her reign connects to themes that recur across time: the fragility of empires, the power of personality, and the ways in which individuals can shape, but not always control, the forces of history. Cleopatra's reign represented the final chapter of pharaonic Egypt. For 3,000 years, pharaohs had ruled along the Nile, presiding over one of the world's oldest and most enduring civilizations. Cleopatra, though Macedonian Greek by descent, assumed this role fully, presenting herself in Egyptian tradition and embodying the pharaoh's divine duties. With her death, that unbroken line ended. Egypt became a province of Rome, its autonomy lost. In this sense, her life marked the close of one era and the beginning of another, the age of the Roman Empire. At the same time, Cleopatra's story highlights the shifting balance of power in the Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic dynasty had once been among the most powerful of Alexander the Great's successors, but by Cleopatra's time, it was overshadowed by Rome's rise. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony reflect the reality that survival depended on engagement with Rome's internal struggles. For a time, she exploited those divisions skillfully, keeping Egypt independent, but ultimately, the sheer momentum of Roman expansion proved unstoppable. Cleopatra's defeat illustrates how even the most resourceful ruler could not withstand the tide of empire. Yet her influence went beyond politics. Cleopatra demonstrated the role of personality in history. She captivated two of Rome's greatest leaders, not only with personal charm, but with political intelligence and presence. Her ability to shape events through personal relationships reflects a recurring theme in world history: the power of individuals, especially those who understand the value of image, persuasion, and timing. Like Alexander before her, or Napoleon centuries later, Cleopatra used charisma as much as armies to pursue her ambitions. Her reign also resonates as a story of identity and cultural blending. As queen between Egyptian, Greek, and Roman worlds, she exemplified the interconnectedness of civilizations. In her court, Egyptian rituals stood beside Greek philosophy, and Roman politics shaped daily decisions. This blending anticipated the cultural fusions that have often accompanied empires and global exchanges throughout history. Cleopatra's life reminds us that history is rarely neat or separate. It is formed at the intersections of peoples and traditions. For women in history, Cleopatra holds a special place. Few female rulers of antiquity wielded such direct power. She commanded armies, governed a wealthy kingdom, and made decisions that influenced the fate of the Roman Republic itself. Her story challenges assumptions about women's roles in the past. Though often reduced in legend to a seductress, the reality is that she was a capable ruler navigating extraordinary challenges. In this way, she stands as a forerunner to later women in power, from Elizabeth I of England to Catherine the Great of Russia, each of whom faced similar scrutiny and fascination. Her defeat, however, also illustrates the limits of individual agency. Cleopatra was brilliant, resourceful, and daring, yet she could not overcome the structural power of Rome. This tension between individual brilliance and overwhelming historical forces is central to her story. It explains both her allure and her tragedy. She reminds us that history is shaped by both human choice and larger currents beyond anyone's control. In world history, Cleopatra remains one of the most recognizable names, remembered not only in historical accounts, but in literature, art, and film. Her story crosses boundaries of time and culture, resonating in different ways for different generations. She has been villain and heroine, seductress and sovereign, cautionary tale, and symbol of empowerment. Few historical figures have carried so many layers of meaning, reflecting the concerns of those who remember her as much as the reality of her life. Thus, Cleopatra's place in history is unique. She was the last pharaoh, the queen who stood against Rome, the woman who made herself unforgettable. She belongs to Egypt, to Greece, to Rome, and to the world. Her life captures the drama of an era when old civilizations gave way to new empires, when individual ambition collided with vast historical change. In the next and final segment, we will conclude our journey by reflecting on Cleopatra's enduring legacy, how she continues to captivate the imagination today, and why her story, more than 2,000 years later, still speaks so powerfully to us. We have followed Cleopatra from her childhood in the turbulent court of the Ptolemies to her final days in Alexandria, and beyond into the centuries of legend that followed. Now, as we conclude, we turn to her enduring legacy, a legacy that remains alive more than 2,000 years after her death. Cleopatra endures because her story touches on universal themes. She was the last of a dynasty, struggling to preserve her kingdom against overwhelming odds. She was a woman in power in a world dominated by men, navigating alliances, betrayals, and wars with intelligence and boldness. She was a ruler who embodied both spectacle and substance, mastering the art of image while also handling the practical demands of governance. Above all, she was a human being caught in the great currents of history, whose choices shaped the fate of nations but could not overcome the tide of empire. Her legacy begins with Egypt itself. For her subjects, Cleopatra was the last pharaoh, the last ruler to embody the divine traditions of their ancient civilization. In temples, she appeared as Isis, uniting religious faith with political authority. Her death marked the end of 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. The fact that Egyptians remembered her in this role shows how deeply she connected with her people, even though her dynasty had foreign origins. Her legacy also lies in the Roman world. For Octavian, soon to be Augustus, Cleopatra was the enemy whose defeat secured his power and transformed the Republic into the empire. Without Octavian, without Alexandria, without Cleopatra's fall, Augustus's rise might not have taken the same form. In this sense, Cleopatra shaped the very foundations of Rome's imperial age. In memory and myth, her legacy has been even greater. Roman propaganda turned her into a symbol of decadence and corruption, a foreign queen who seduced Rome's leaders. Yet, even as they vilified her, they made her unforgettable. Writers like Plutarch, poets like Horace, and later dramatists like Shakespeare ensured that her story lived on. Over the centuries, she was reimagined again and again by Renaissance artists, romantic painters, modern filmmakers. Each age found something in her story that spoke to its own concerns: love, ambition, independence, tragedy. Today, Cleopatra remains one of the most recognized figures of antiquity. Her name evokes images of beauty, power, and intrigue. She is remembered not only as the lover of Caesar and Antony, but as a sovereign who ruled Egypt with intelligence and determination. Modern scholarship has worked to strip away the layers of propaganda, revealing a queen who was multilingual, politically astute, and deeply committed to her kingdom. In this light, Cleopatra stands not just as a legend, but as one of the most capable rulers of her time. Her legacy also resonates in the broader history of women in power. Cleopatra faced scrutiny and hostility familiar to many women leaders, even in later centuries. Her relationships were judged more harshly than those of men. Her ambition was cast as dangerous. Her image was used as a weapon against her. Yet she endured, and in doing so, she became a symbol of female agency in a world that denied it. That she continues to inspire fascination today is evidence of the path she blazed, even in an age where the odds were stacked against her. Finally, her legacy lies in her refusal to be forgotten. Cleopatra crafted her image carefully during her life, through coins, ceremonies, and public spectacle. In death, she chose to end her life on her own terms, denying Octavian the triumph he desired. This final act ensured that she would be remembered not as a captive, but as a queen. In this way, she succeeded. More than 2 millennia later, her story is still told, her name still spoken, her image still recreated in art and film. Few figures in history have achieved such lasting presence. Cleopatra's life was a story of ambition, brilliance, and resilience. It was also a story of tragedy, for she lost not only her throne, but her life, her dynasty, and her dreams of empire. Yet tragedy is often what makes a story endure. Cleopatra stands among the great figures of world history, not because she won, but because she fought with determination, lived with intensity, and died with dignity. As we close, we are left with the image of Cleopatra in her mausoleum, adorned in royal robes, choosing death rather than submission. She was the last of the pharaohs, the queen who defied Rome, the woman who became legend. Her legacy belongs not only to Egypt, not only to Rome, but to all of history. For in Cleopatra, we see the enduring truth that individuals, even when defeated, can shape the memory of civilizations for centuries to come.